My name is Elizabeth Anderson. I was 34 years old when my older brother changed the locks on the family estate while I was inside holding our mother's ashes. I had spent 3 years living in the guest house, acting as our parents' full-time medical proxy. I managed the hospice schedules, the oxygen deliveries, and the midnight emergency room runs, while balancing a remote job in supply chain logistics. My brother Richard lived 3 states away, funding his lifestyle with our parents' retirement money while calling himself an entrepreneur. The day after the funeral, he stood on my porch with a locksmith. A week later, at the official will reading, he looked across the mahogany conference table and said, "Hope you enjoy being homeless, Elizabeth, because I made sure you get nothing." He thought he held all the cards. Then the estate lawyer turned to the final section of the legal binder. When the lawyer read my actual net worth out loud, my brother went pale, his knees buckled, and he collapsed unconscious onto the marble floor. Before we get into exactly what the lawyer said, if you enjoy stories about family betrayals and the quiet revenge they inspire, take a second to subscribe to the Elena Vengeance channel. Drop a comment below, tell me your age, and let me know where you are listening from right now. Now let me take you to the Tuesday afternoon when everything fell apart. The high-pitched whine of a titanium drill bit biting into brass is a sound that sticks in your teeth. It was 4 p.m. The dirt on our parents' graves in Des Moines, Iowa had not even settled yet. The scent of lilies and cold earth still clung to my dark wool coat. I stood in the center of the guest house living room, gripping the heavy brass urn containing my mother's ashes. Through the frosted glass of the bay window, I watched a locksmith destroy my deadbolt. Richard stood right behind the locksmith. The winter wind was biting 18 degrees outside, but Richard looked unaffected inside his pristine navy blue custom suit. I knew that suit cost $3,000 because I had seen the charge pending on my mother's credit card 2 days before she died. Next to him stood his wife, Stephanie. She held a steaming paper cup from an expensive coffee shop, looking at my front door like she was waiting for a movie to start. The door swung open, letting the freezing Iowa air sweep across the hardwood floor. Richard stepped inside, leaving the locksmith on the porch. He did not look at the urn in my hands. He looked at the television, the bookshelves, the furniture. "I am the executor now, Elizabeth." His voice carried a rehearsed authority. "The estate is locked down. You have 20 minutes to pack your clothes. Leave the electronics. Everything in this structure belongs to the trust." I did not yell. I did not ask him how he could do this mere hours after we buried the people who raised us. I looked at his polished leather shoes. Then I walked to the bedroom, pulled a canvas duffel bag from the closet, and packed 5 days of clothes. I walked back out, passing Stephanie, who stepped aside with a faint smirk. I walked out into the freezing wind and climbed into my Honda Civic. My hands were stiff as I started the engine and turned on the heat. I needed a place to sleep. I pulled my phone from my pocket and opened my banking app to book a room at the Highway Motel 10 miles down the road. The screen glowed bright against the dim interior of the car. The loading icon spun for 3 seconds. Then the numbers populated. My personal checking account showed a balance of $12.40. My linked savings account showed 0. The screen blurred. My chest tightened. I was the primary signer on the joint medical account. Richard had not just changed the physical locks on my door. He had found a way to freeze my money. My name is Elizabeth Anderson. I was 34 years old when my older brother changed the locks on the family estate while I was inside holding our mother's ashes. I had spent 3 years living in the guest house, acting as our parents' full-time medical proxy. I managed the hospice schedules, the oxygen deliveries, and the midnight emergency room runs, while balancing a remote job in supply chain logistics. My brother Richard lived 3 states away, funding his lifestyle with our parents' retirement money, while calling himself an entrepreneur. The day after the funeral, he stood on my porch with a locksmith. A week later, at the official will reading, he looked across the mahogany conference table and said, "Hope you enjoy being homeless, Elizabeth, because I made sure you get nothing." He thought he held all the cards. Then the estate lawyer turned to the final section of the legal binder. When the lawyer read my actual net worth out loud, my brother went pale, his knees buckled, and he collapsed unconscious onto the marble floor. Before we get into exactly what the lawyer said, if you enjoy stories about family betrayals and the quiet revenge they inspire, take a second to subscribe to the Elena Vengeance channel. Drop a comment below, tell me your age, and let me know where you are listening from right now. Now let me take you to Tuesday afternoon when everything fell apart. The high-pitched whine of a titanium drill bit biting into brass is a sound that sticks in your teeth. It was 4 p.m. The dirt on our parents' graves in Des Moines, Iowa, had not even settled yet. The scent of lilies and cold earth still clung to my dark wool coat. I stood in the center of the guest house living room, gripping the heavy brass urn containing my mother's ashes. Through the frosted glass of the bay window, I watched a locksmith destroy my deadbolt. Richard stood right behind the locksmith. The winter wind was biting, 18 degrees outside, but Richard looked unaffected inside his pristine navy blue custom suit. I knew that suit cost $3,000 because I had seen the charge pending on my mother's credit card 2 days before she died. Next to him stood his wife, Stephanie. She held a steaming paper cup from an expensive coffee shop, looking at my front door like she was waiting for a movie to start. The door swung open, letting the freezing Iowa air sweep across the hardwood floor. Richard stepped inside, leaving the locksmith on the porch. He did not look at the urn in my hands. He looked at the television, the bookshelves, the furniture. I am the executor now, Elizabeth. His voice carried a rehearsed authority. The estate is locked down. You have 20 minutes to pack your clothes. Leave the electronics. Everything in this structure belongs to the trust. I did not yell. I did not ask him how he could do this mere hours after we buried the people who raised us. I looked at his polished leather shoes. Then I walked to the bedroom, pulled a canvas duffel bag from the closet, and packed 5 days of clothes. I walked back out, passing Stephanie, who stepped aside with a faint smirk. I walked out into the freezing wind and climbed into my Honda Civic. My hands were stiff as I started the engine and turned on the heat. I needed a place to sleep. I pulled my phone from my pocket and opened my banking app to book a room at the Highway Motel 10 miles down the road. The screen glowed bright against the dim interior of the car. The loading icon spun for 3 seconds. Then the numbers populated. My personal checking account showed a balance of exactly $312. My secondary savings account showed 0. And the joint family trust account, the one I had managed every single day for the past 3 years, displayed a stark gray padlock icon with the words, "Access restricted." For a few seconds, I forgot to breathe. My lungs felt tight, restricted by the sheer audacity of the digital wall in front of me. As a supply chain director, I spend my life living inside spreadsheets, databases, and predictive algorithms. I track cargo ships across the Pacific. I reroute multi-million-dollar shipments around global port strikes. I understand numbers. And the numbers on my screen were telling a story of calculated financial strangulation. For the last 3 years, I had served as our parents' full-time medical proxy. When my mother required round-the-clock hospice care, the bills ran $4,000 a week. The nurses needed prompt payment to keep their shifts. 2 months ago, the estate trust began experiencing mysterious verification delays. The bank flagged several authorization requests requiring signatures from both proxy holders. Richard lived in Chicago, but he was the secondary signer. He ignored the bank emails, claiming he was locked out of his email or too busy pitching venture capitalists for his latest imaginary tech startup. To keep the hospice nurses from walking out, I started floating the weekly $4,000 payments out of my own personal savings. I drained my investment accounts. I liquidated my stock portfolio. I did it because I knew the estate trust held more than enough capital to reimburse me once the administrative hold cleared. I treated it like a standard supply chain deficit. You cover the localized shortfall to keep the operation running, knowing the bulk shipment will arrive to balance the ledger. But Richard had not just ignored the bank emails. He had used a forged power of attorney to quietly restructure the trust hierarchy. He waited until the very week our mother died to trigger a freeze on my proxy access, trapping my reimbursement funds behind a legal firewall he controlled. I tapped the gray padlock icon on my screen. The banking app glitched, trying to process the sudden restriction, and loaded a cached version of the recent transaction history before kicking me back to the login screen. It only gave me a 10-second window, but my eyes are trained to scan data rows instantly. 2 line items burned themselves into my memory. The first was a wire transfer for $42,000. The timestamp read 8:14 in the morning. That was 3 days ago. It was the exact morning my mother took her last breath in the downstairs bedroom. While I was holding her fragile hand, waiting for the hospice nurse to declare the time of death, my brother was authorizing an outbound wire. I recognized the routing prefix. It traced back to a Miami-based offshore crypto exchange. He was not securing family assets to protect the estate. He was laundering money into untraceable digital wallets. The second line item was a point of sale charge for $3,000. The vendor was a bespoke Italian tailor located in downtown Chicago. The charge cleared 48 hours ago. I looked through my windshield at Richard standing on the front porch of the guest house. He was adjusting the lapels of his pristine navy blue custom suit. The math clicked into place with sickening precision. My brother was literally wearing our mother's end-of-life care on his back. He had siphoned the money intended for the woman who birthed him to purchase a tailored costume so he could play the role of the wealthy, grieving son at her funeral. He looked so proud of himself standing there chatting with the locksmith. He assumed his strategy was bulletproof. He was attempting to financially suffocate me. In his mind, taking away my cash meant I could not hire a probate litigator. Without a lawyer, I could not fight the forged power of attorney. He thought stripping my resources would force me into compliance, making me a quiet, obedient victim who would slink away into the Iowa winter and leave him the keys to the kingdom. Richard always possessed a very narrow imagination. He understood bullying, but he did not understand logistics. In supply chain management, when a primary routing channel is blocked, you do not sit in your vehicle and cry over the blocked road. You audit the vulnerabilities of the blockage. You map the secondary routes. You identify the structural weaknesses of the obstacle itself. Richard was a blockade, but he was a sloppy one. He left digital footprints. He made purchases using traceable accounts. He acted on impulse, fueled by entitlement and hidden debts. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the cold air clear the panic from my chest. I did not need $300 to destroy him. I needed my data. Inside the guest house, hidden beneath a loose oak floorboard under my desk, were 2 encrypted solid-state hard drives. Those drives contained every receipt, every medical log, every security camera backup, and every financial ledger from the past 3 years. They were the raw materials I needed to build a case that would bypass a civil probate dispute and head straight to a federal wire fraud investigation. I watched Richard shake the locksmith's hand. The tradesman packed his tools into a metal box and walked toward his service van parked at the end of the gravel driveway. Richard turned and went inside the guest house, pulling the heavy oak door shut behind him. The lock clicked. I wrapped my hands around the steering wheel, feeling the stiff leather beneath my palms. I just needed him to leave the property so I could slip around back and use the spare window key I kept hidden inside the hollow body of a fake resin rock near the garden hose. I only needed 5 minutes inside to pry up the floorboard and secure my hard drives. But the situation shifted before I could even turn off the car engine. Stephanie emerged from the side door of the main estate house. She was no longer watching the scene like a bored spectator. She set her paper coffee cup down on the edge of the stone planter. She pulled her designer faux fur coat tighter around her shoulders and marched straight across the frozen lawn toward the guest house. She did not go to the front door to join her husband. Instead, she walked directly toward the gray metal utility box mounted on the exterior siding of the guest house. I leaned forward, squinting through the frosty windshield. The utility box controlled the localized power grid and the main water valve for the secondary structure. My chest tightened again, this time with a sharp spike of adrenaline. A legal eviction process in the state of Iowa takes a minimum of 30 days and requires a judge to sign a formal court order. Even with a forged executor document, Richard knew the local sheriff would not forcibly remove a resident without a court date. They did not want to wait 30 days. They did not want to pay for a court filing. They wanted me gone tonight. I watched Stephanie grab the cold metal latch of the utility box and yank it open. She was smiling, a thin, predatory smile that told me she had been waiting for this exact moment. She reached inside the metal housing and grabbed the heavy black main breaker switch. The conflict was no longer just digital. The attack was turning physical, and the temperature was dropping fast. My name is Elizabeth Anderson. I was 34 years old when my older brother changed the locks on the family estate while I was inside holding our mother's ashes. I had spent 3 years living in the guest house, acting as our parents' full-time medical proxy. I managed the hospice schedules, the oxygen deliveries, and the midnight emergency room runs while balancing a remote job in supply chain logistics. My brother Richard lived 3 states away, funding his lifestyle with our parents' retirement money while calling himself an entrepreneur. The day after the funeral, he stood on my porch with a locksmith. A week later, at the official will reading, he looked across the mahogany conference table and said, "Hope you enjoy being homeless, Elizabeth, because I made sure you get nothing." He thought he held all the cards. Then the estate lawyer turned to the final section of the legal binder. When the lawyer read my actual net worth out loud, my brother went pale, his knees buckled, and he collapsed unconscious onto the marble floor. Before we get into exactly what the lawyer said, if you enjoy stories about family betrayals and the quiet revenge they inspire, take a second to subscribe to the Elena Vengeance channel. Drop a comment below, tell me your age, and let me know where you are listening from right now. Now let me take you to the Tuesday afternoon when everything fell apart. Stephanie did not hesitate. Her manicured hand gripped the heavy black main breaker switch inside the gray utility box. She yanked it downward with a sharp, metallic clack. Instantly, the warm yellow glow spilling from the guest house windows vanished. The low, steady hum of the forced air heating unit wound down into an eerie silence. She was not finished. She reached deeper into the metal housing and gripped the circular iron valve controlling the water main. She twisted it clockwise until the pipes groaned and shuddered under the sudden pressure drop. Inside the guest house, my brother had just walked into the living room. Plunged into sudden freezing darkness, Richard stumbled. I heard his leather shoes scuff against the hardwood floor, followed by a muffled curse as his shin found the edge of the coffee table. The front door swung open again. Richard emerged, rubbing his leg, his breath pluming in the frigid air. He glared at his wife, standing by the open utility panel. "What are you doing, Stephanie?" he snapped. "I am trying to inventory the furniture." Stephanie offered a dismissive wave of her hand, adjusting her faux fur coat. "I am speeding up the timeline," she replied. "We are not waiting for her to pack." This was my window. In logistics, a distraction is just an unscheduled operational advantage. While my brother and his wife stood on the frozen front lawn bickering over their crude tactics, I slipped out of the driver's seat of my Honda. I kept my posture low, moving silently along the shadow line of the tall perimeter hedges. The wind howled through the bare oak branches, masking the crunch of my boots on the frost-covered grass. I bypassed the front yard entirely and navigated toward the rear patio. Beside the coiled garden hose sat a hollow resin rock. I turned it over, retrieving the spare brass key hidden inside the plastic cavity. I slid the key into the deadbolt of the back door. It turned with a satisfying click. I stepped into the kitchen. The ambient temperature was already plummeting. Iowa winters do not wait for invitations. The structural cold seeped through the floorboards, biting through the soles of my boots. I pulled my phone from my coat pocket and activated the flashlight, holding the beam low to the ground to avoid casting illumination onto the front windows. I navigated past the kitchen island and down the short hallway into the home office. The space smelled of old paper and the sharp metallic tang of cooling heating ducts. For 3 years, this room served as my command center. It was where I balanced shipping manifests for my corporate job while simultaneously organizing oxygen tank deliveries for my mother. When Richard began acting erratic 2 years prior, demanding early inheritance advances and throwing tantrums about his failed tech ventures, I realized the family accounts were vulnerable. A seasoned supply chain director never trusts a single point of failure. You build redundancies. I knelt beside the heavy oak desk. I pressed my fingers against the seam of the third floorboard from the wall. I applied lateral pressure, sliding the wood plank backward until it disengaged from the hidden groove. Beneath the board rested a fireproof, locked steel lockbox. Inside that box lay 2 military-grade encrypted solid-state hard drives. I lifted the drives. The cold metal felt heavy in my palms. These small rectangular blocks contained mirrored backups of every financial ledger, every medical receipt, and every piece of home security footage spanning 36 months. They were my insurance policy. I tucked them securely into the deep inside pocket of my wool coat. I slid the floorboard back into place, ensuring the seam aligned perfectly. I retraced my steps through the pitch-black kitchen, exiting the back door and locking it behind me. I circled back along the hedge line, walking briskly toward my parked vehicle. As I approached the driver's side door, Stephanie spotted me. She stood near the frozen rose bushes, clutching her paper cup. She took a slow, deliberate sip of her matcha latte, enjoying her perceived victory. "Oops, looks like the pipes are winterized," she yelled, her voice cutting through the biting wind. "Better leave before you freeze." Her tactic was an illegal self-help eviction. Under state tenant laws, shutting off essential utilities to force an occupant out carries severe financial penalties. I could have called the local sheriff. I could have stood on the frozen lawn quoting municipal housing codes and demanding restoration of services. But engaging in a screaming match would only validate their illusion of power. They wanted a chaotic, emotional reaction. I gave them nothing. I opened my car door. I did not look at her. I did not utter a single word. I climbed inside, started the ignition, and shifted into drive. My tires crunched over the gravel as I pulled away from the property, leaving Stephanie smirking into the empty cold. I drove south along the interstate, the heater blasting against my stiff hands. 10 miles outside the city limits, I found an older roadside motel. The neon vacancy sign buzzed with a rhythmic electrical hum, missing half its red letters. I parked near the back of the lot. I walked into the cramped lobby and handed the night clerk $50 in crisp 20s from the emergency cash stash I always kept in my glove box. Untraceable transactions provide a necessary layer of operational security when your primary assets are compromised. Room 7 smelled of stale cigarette smoke and cheap lemon bleach. The floral bedspread sagged in the middle. The single fluorescent tube above the sink flickered, casting pale, unsteady light across the peeling wallpaper. I locked the deadbolt, fastened the chain, and dropped my canvas duffel bag onto the floor. I sat on the edge of the mattress. The mattress springs groaned beneath my weight. In the quiet isolation of that drab room, the gravity of the afternoon finally settled over my shoulders. My own brother and his wife were actively trying to destroy me. They had evicted me from my home hours after a funeral. They had stolen funds meant to comfort a dying woman. They were attempting to erase my entire existence to cover their own greed. But they had fundamentally misunderstood my silence. They thought my refusal to argue was a symptom of surrender. They believed they had driven me into the dark. They did not understand that I was not retreating. I was establishing a secure perimeter. You cannot counterattack while standing in the impact zone. You retreat to higher ground, assess the munitions, and plot the trajectory of the return fire. I unzipped my coat and pulled the 2 encrypted hard drives from my pocket. I set them on the scratched laminate surface of the small circular table near the window. I opened my laptop and connected the interface cable. The screen illuminated, casting a blue reflection against my face. A password prompt appeared, demanding a 32-character alphanumeric sequence. My fingers flew across the keyboard, entering the cipher from memory. The progress bar filled, turning solid green. The drives unlocked. Folders populated the screen, categorized by month, year, and asset class. I double-clicked the master financial registry, diving straight into the transaction history I had briefly glimpsed on my phone. I needed to trace the $42,000 wire transfer to Miami. I needed to see exactly how deep Richard's offshore crypto trail went. But as I opened the subfolder labeled Emergency Medical Disbursements, a different document caught my eye. It was an archived video file tagged with a date from 3 weeks prior. The thumbnail preview showed the dim interior of my mother's bedroom, taken from the hidden security camera I installed to monitor the night shift nurses. The timestamp read 2 a.m. I clicked play, and the true depth of the betrayal began to unfold. For 3 days, I lived inside the suffocating confines of Room 7. The air always smelled faintly of old dust and artificial lemon cleaner. The sagging mattress offered no rest, so I spent my hours sitting in the rigid wooden chair at the small circular table near the window. The thin curtains remained drawn against the bleak Iowa winter, blocking out the gray daylight. My only source of illumination was the harsh blue glow of my laptop screen. I survived on black coffee from a styrofoam cup and stale crackers from the lobby vending machine. My physical comfort was irrelevant. I was operating in a state of hyperfocus, mapping a battlefield constructed entirely of numbers. Tracking the $42,000 crypto transfer was a meticulous process. Richard thought sending the funds to an offshore exchange in Miami would scrub the origin point. He utilized digital tumbling software, attempting to fracture the initial deposit into dozens of fractional anonymous wallets. It is a common obfuscation tactic used by amateur embezzlers. But as a supply chain director, I understand that nothing truly disappears. Every digital asset leaves a receipt, a ledger entry, a node connecting point A to point B. You just have to follow the negative space. I spent 48 hours reverse engineering his routing protocols. The Miami transfer was merely the tip of the spear. As I parsed deeper into the historical data, cross-referencing the estate operational fund with my encrypted backups, the true scale of the financial hemorrhage revealed itself. Richard had been bleeding the accounts through a series of microtransactions for months. I found recurring capital injections sent to a defunct tech incubator in Illinois. I uncovered monthly wire transfers directed to shell companies associated with high-stakes offshore sports betting. The data painted a vivid portrait of a man drowning in a self-inflicted ocean of liability. Staring at a particularly damning ledger entry dated 2 years prior, a cold realization washed over me. The date on the screen was November 14th. That specific alphanumeric string triggered a visceral memory, pulling my mind away from the cramped motel room and dropping me back into the sterile cardiology wing of Mercy Hospital. 2 years ago, my mother suffered a minor cardiac event requiring a week of inpatient observation. Her vascular dementia was already advancing rapidly. She spent most of her hospital stay trapped in a dense cognitive fog, holding whispered conversations with relatives who had passed away decades earlier. The nurses warned me her lucid intervals would become increasingly rare. I sat by her bedside late one evening. The hospital corridor was quiet save for the squeak of rubber soles on linoleum and the rhythmic mechanical hiss of her oxygen concentrator. The room smelled of sharp iodine and bleached cotton. I was reading a book under the dim cone of the reading light, assuming she was asleep. Without warning, her hand shot out from beneath the thin thermal blanket. Her fingers locked around my left wrist. She was a frail woman, diminished by illness, but her grip in that moment possessed a shocking, unyielding strength. Her fingernails dug into my skin, leaving deep half-moon crescents. I dropped my book and leaned forward, expecting to see the familiar clouded gaze of her dementia. Instead, her eyes were piercingly clear. The fog had parted, leaving behind a terrifying, stark lucidity. She looked directly into my pupils, anchoring me in place. "Your brother will sell the soil to pay for his sins," she whispered. Her voice was raspy dry as autumn leaves, but vibrating with absolute certainty. "He will pave over the farm. Protect it, Elizabeth. Protect yourself." I sat frozen under the harsh fluorescent lights. She did not blink. She was not experiencing a hallucination. This was a dying woman evaluating her own son with devastating surgical accuracy. A few seconds later, the tension left her shoulders. Her grip loosened, her eyes clouded over once again, and she drifted back into the safe, distant past, murmuring a recipe to a sister who died in 1998. That chilling prophecy became the defining catalyst for my entire existence. My mother knew Richard possessed an entitlement that would eventually mutate into unchecked predation. That late-night warning is the reason I stopped hoping my brother would mature. It is the reason I started preparing for a protracted siege. Now sitting in the motel room reviewing the audited ledgers, her warning echoed in the silence. Her prophecy was documented right in front of my eyes in rows of red text. Richard was systematically funneling our family legacy to pay off his staggering hidden debts. He was paving over the farm, one fraudulent wire transfer at a time. By the dawn of the third day, my eyes burned from screen fatigue. The sun was just beginning to cast long, pale shadows across the frosted asphalt of the parking lot outside. I closed my eyes for a brief moment, massaging my temples. My phone vibrated against the laminate table. The sudden buzzing shattered the quiet concentration of the room. I picked up the device. A single email notification rested on the lock screen. The sender was Arthur Davis, the senior partner at the law firm handling our family estate. I tapped the icon and scanned the message. The text was drenched in formal legal jargon, but the underlying urgency was unmistakable. Richard was escalating the timeline. He had formally petitioned the county probate court, demanding an expedited reading of the will. The proceeding was now scheduled for 9 o'clock the following morning at the law firm. Mr. Davis included a brief explanation regarding the sudden acceleration. Richard had submitted a sworn affidavit to the judge, claiming I constituted an active flight risk. My brother officially accused me of attempting to steal valuable estate property, specifically citing the Honda Civic I drove away in on the day of the lockout. I read the email a second time, analyzing the strategic maneuver. The Honda was a cheap deflection, a fabricated excuse to force the court's hand. The underlying strategy was transparent. Richard was rushing the legal clock. By accelerating the will reading, he aimed to cement his authority as the sole, unquestioned executor. He needed the official gavel to drop before the banking institutions flagged the empty accounts. He needed the legal title finalized before any forensic auditor could scrutinize the forged proxy signatures. He wanted to secure the ironclad shield of the executorship while I remained locked out, frozen, and financially defenseless in a cheap motel. He assumed speed would create blind spots, preventing me from mounting a coherent defense. But rushing a logistical operation often breeds fatal systemic errors. The financial ledgers on my screen proved his desperate motive. I had the transactional receipts mapping his debts, his gambling, and his laundering tactics. But in a civil probate hearing, financial anomalies can be contested, delayed, and buried under endless motions. Circumstantial ledgers would not stop him from taking immediate control of the physical property tomorrow morning. I needed undeniable visual proof of his corruption. I needed to document exactly how he gained the fraudulent authority to drain those accounts in the first place. I needed a weapon that no defense attorney could spin. I minimized the financial spreadsheets and returned to the main root directory of my encrypted hard drive. I scrolled past the medical receipts and the banking exports. I located the archived folder containing the interior surveillance feeds from the guest house. It was time to look at the security footage. The encrypted folder containing the interior surveillance feeds held terabytes of high-definition video. I had installed the discrete camera lenses myself 18 months prior, hiding them inside the bedroom's smoke detectors and living room bookshelves. The original intent was to monitor the rotating shifts of night nurses, ensuring my mother received her scheduled pain medication without interruption. I never imagined the surveillance system would become an instrument of forensic auditing against my own blood. Sitting in the dim motel room, I initiated the playback software. I needed to find the exact moment Richard orchestrated the fraudulent update to the family trust. I set the playback speed to 8 times normal. The screen transformed into a rapid blur of shifting light. Sunbeams crawled across the bedroom walls, turning into evening shadows, which then bled into the eerie green wash of the infrared night vision. I watched days collapse into seconds. I saw myself bringing in meal trays, adjusting blankets, and sitting by the bedside. It took 4 grueling hours of continuous scrubbing to find the anomaly. My eyes ached from the harsh screen glare, but my hand froze over the trackpad the moment the visual pattern broke. I paused the feed and checked the timestamp. The digital clock read 2 a.m. The date was exactly 3 weeks prior. I reverted the playback speed to normal and hit play. The green-tinted infrared footage displayed my mother lying motionless in her hospital-style adjustable bed. The heavy oak door to her bedroom cracked open. 2 figures slipped inside the room, moving with calculated silence. Richard stepped into the frame first. He wore a casual sweater holding a thick wooden clipboard. Stephanie followed close behind him, carrying a pen and a small penlight. They approached the bed. My mother did not stir. Her chest rose and fell in shallow, uneven rhythms characteristic of advanced vascular dementia. She was heavily medicated on sedatives designed to ease her chronic joint pain. I watched the screen, my breath turning shallow. Stephanie leaned over the mattress, placing her hand behind my mother's shoulders and physically hoisting the frail woman into a semi-upright position. My mother's head lolled to the side. She was entirely unresponsive, trapped in a deep chemical sleep. Richard stepped closer, resting the clipboard against the bed sheets. Stephanie took my mother's limp right hand. She pressed the pen into the fragile fingers, curling her own manicured grip over the knuckles to lock the plastic barrel in place. Together, they dragged my mother's hand across the signature line at the bottom of the legal document. It was a grotesque pantomime of legal consent. They were puppeteering a dying woman. A sharp metallic taste coated the back of my throat. My stomach clenched, forcing me to push the chair back from the table. I stood up, pacing the short span of the motel room, trying to process the sheer depravity of the act. They had violated the final weeks of her life to secure their own financial comfort. I did not let the nausea take root. Anger is a useful fuel, but only when refined into action. I picked up my phone and dialed the direct cellular number for Dr. Evans, the lead neurologist who had managed my mother's cognitive decline for 4 years. It was early in the morning, but doctors who deal with terminal patients rarely adhere to standard business hours. He answered on the second ring. I explained the situation, omitting the emotional betrayal, and focusing strictly on the clinical timeline. I asked him a single, precise question. Dr. Evans, based on her pharmaceutical chart and cognitive assessments 3 weeks ago, was my mother capable of comprehending a legal contract? His response was immediate and thick with professional disgust. Elizabeth, your mother could not remember how to swallow water 3 weeks ago. She was entirely non-compos mentis. Her brain lacked the synaptic function to form intent. I asked him to put that medical certainty into a sworn affidavit. 10 minutes later, a secure PDF arrived in my inbox. The document bore his digital signature and the official letterhead of Mercy Hospital. The text unequivocally stated that the patient lacked all legal capacity to execute a will, trust, or any binding agreement for the final 6 months of her life. Armed with the undeniable video evidence and a bulletproof medical affidavit, I felt the balance of power shifting. I had the ammunition required to destroy the forged document. I needed a tactical assessment from a legal operator who possessed no ties to my family. Mr. Davis was the estate lawyer, but his firm specialized in standard probate execution, not hostile litigation. I utilized my corporate network to secure an emergency Zoom consultation with a senior probate litigator based in Des Moines. I opened the video conferencing application. The litigator appeared on my screen, sitting in a leather chair framed by towering bookshelves. His face bore the deep lines of a man who spent decades arguing over the bitter remains of wealthy families. I shared my screen, broadcasting the sworn medical affidavit and recounting the specific details of the 2 a.m. surveillance footage. I laid out my defensive strategy, expecting him to confirm that Richard would face immediate criminal indictment and the fraudulent will would be struck down upon presentation of the facts. Instead, the litigator sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. He offered me a terrifying reality check. Elizabeth, the law is not a math equation. He leaned closer to his webcam, his voice turning grim. It is a subjective battlefield. You have a doctor stating she was incapacitated, but if your brother retains aggressive defense counsel, they will employ the lucid interval defense. He explained the legal loophole. Defense attorneys routinely argue that dementia patients experience brief, fleeting windows of clarity. They would claim that at 2 a.m. on that specific date, my mother woke up, recognized her son, and willfully signed the document. But I have the video showing her asleep, I countered, my voice tightening. And they will claim the infrared footage is grainy, ambiguous, or misinterpreted, the litigator replied. They will argue she was weak and simply needed physical assistance guiding the pen. If you draw a corrupt or even just a fatigued probate judge facing a heavy docket, they might refuse to grant a summary dismissal. They might push the dispute to a full trial. He delivered the final devastating blow, outlining the financial mechanics of probate warfare. Richard holds the executor title right now. If you file a lawsuit, he will use the estate funds, the very money you are trying to protect, to pay his own defense team. A trial will take 2 years. He will bleed the accounts dry fighting you. Even if you win the verdict, you will inherit an empty trust. This was the red herring. It was a structural trap designed to make justice too expensive to pursue. The litigator logged off, leaving me staring at my own reflection in the darkened screen. A cold spike of genuine despair drove itself into my chest. The walls of the motel room seemed to inch closer. Richard was not a logistical genius. He was utilizing brute force, swinging a hammer at the legal system, knowing the slow grinding gears of the courts would shield him. His crude forgery did not need to be perfect. It only needed to cause enough bureaucratic friction to drain the resources. The broken nature of the probate system was his greatest asset. He could win simply by engaging in a war of financial attrition. I closed my laptop. For a long time I sat in the silence, listening to the rattle of the highway traffic miles away. My carefully constructed perimeter felt useless. Data and logic were failing against the sheer, blunt trauma of legal manipulation. I thought about my mother. I thought about her gripping my wrist in the hospital, demanding I protect the farm. I could not allow a bureaucratic loophole to validate her exploitation. In supply chain mechanics, when a frontal assault against a barrier proves too costly, you do not keep pushing forward. You step back. You inspect the barrier from a micro perspective, searching for a hairline fracture in the foundation. I opened the laptop again. The glare stung my eyes. I brought up the infrared security footage. I scrubbed the timeline backward, dragging the digital marker frame by meticulous frame. I stopped the video at the exact millisecond the pen made contact with the paper. I expanded the window, bypassing the standard viewing resolution and magnifying the specific quadrant of the screen to maximum capacity. The green pixels swelled and distorted, then settled into a stark, grainy focus. I stared at the glowing image. I looked past the clipboard. I looked past my mother's frail, resting form. I focused entirely on the hands executing the forgery. My breath caught. The despair evaporated, replaced by a sharp electric surge of adrenaline. The litigator warned me that a judge might believe my mother simply needed physical assistance guiding the pen. But the magnified image on my screen dismantled that defense before it could ever be spoken aloud. I leaned closer to the monitor, analyzing the grip, the angle, and the distinct shape of the hand holding the plastic barrel. I kept my finger pressed against the trackpad, commanding the software to magnify the specific quadrant of the paused video feed. The image expanded the underlying digital noise, fracturing into blocky, green-tinted squares. I pushed the zoom capability to 400%, bypassing the standard resolution limits until the pixels blurred and then snapped back into a harsh, granular focus. I stared at the glowing rectangle on my laptop screen. The litigator had warned me that a defense attorney would claim my mother simply needed a gentle guiding touch from her son. But the magnified image dismantled that hypothetical defense before it could ever be filed in a courthouse. The hand wrapped around the plastic barrel of the pen did not belong to my brother. Richard possesses broad, unremarkable knuckles and keeps his fingernails bitten down to the quick, a nervous habit he developed during his first failed startup. The hand illuminated on the infrared footage featured long, sculpted acrylic nails filed into sharp almond points. Furthermore, a distinct, heavy gemstone sat upon the ring finger. Under the night vision lens, the diamond solitaire caught the ambient infrared light, creating a blinding, star-shaped flare on the monitor. It was Stephanie. I dragged the viewing window to the left, scanning the periphery of the bedroom. Richard was not even standing near the bed. He was positioned by the heavy oak threshold, his back pressed against the door frame. His posture was rigid, his head swiveling erratically toward the darkened hallway. He was playing the role of the anxious lookout. Stephanie was the one leaning over the mattress. She was the one pressing her physical weight onto my mother's frail shoulder to stabilize the motion. She controlled the grip, she controlled the ink, she controlled the outcome. A quiet hum of electricity buzzed from the motel mini-fridge, providing the only soundtrack to the revelation crystallizing in my mind. Richard was too incompetent to execute a binding legal forgery on his own. He lacked the steady nerve required to mimic a signature. His wife, however, possessed the ruthless execution he lacked. I needed to verify the theory. In logistics, a visual hypothesis requires secondary material confirmation. I pushed my chair back, the wooden legs scraping against the thin carpet. I unzipped the side pocket of my canvas duffel bag and retrieved a folded piece of paper. It was the formal notice to quit, the pseudo-legal eviction document Stephanie had waved in my face during the lockout. She had drafted it herself, claiming it bore my father's signature from days prior. I smoothed the crumpled paper flat on the laminate table, placing it directly beneath the glow of the desk lamp. Then I opened a separate window on my computer, pulling up a high-resolution scan of the fraudulent will they had submitted to the probate court. I placed the physical eviction notice next to the digital signature on the screen. Supply chain auditing trains the eye to spot microscopic deviations in manufacturing patterns. Human handwriting is just another biological pattern, subject to the same rules of structural consistency. I studied the capital letters first. The loops on the uppercase R in my father's supposed signature on the eviction notice matched the exact same disproportionate top-heavy curve found on the C in my mother's forged signature on the will. I moved to the horizontal strokes. When Stephanie crossed a lowercase t, she applied excessive downward pressure, causing the ink line to taper into a sharp, dagger-like point. That identical, harsh-driving pen stroke existed on both documents. The hesitation marks, the rightward slant, the spacing between the vowels, every forensic metric aligned perfectly. Stephanie was not just a greedy bystander cheering on her husband from the sidelines. She was the architect. She was the primary forger. This discovery shattered the assumed dynamic of their partnership. They were not presenting a united front built on mutual loyalty. They were co-conspirators, lashed together by panic, entitlement, and crushing secret debts. Richard married a woman who mirrored his own hollow ambition, and together they engineered a crime to save their failing lifestyle in Chicago. Understanding their internal hierarchy changed my entire defensive posture. A partnership forged in financial desperation is inherently brittle. When a structure is brittle, you do not need to attack it with overwhelming force. You do not need to waste years fighting a protracted, expensive war of attrition inside a civil courtroom. If I applied the correct amount of calculated pressure to the weakest fault line of their marriage, the entire facade would collapse inward. The moment self-preservation kicked in, they would turn on each other. The despair that had gripped my chest only an hour ago evaporated, replaced by a cold, clinical anticipation. The probate litigator was wrong. I did not need to worry about a corrupt judge validating a lucid interval. I just needed to let my brother and his wife walk blindly into the trap they had unknowingly set for themselves. I closed the forensic viewing software and safely ejected the encrypted hard drives. I powered down the laptop, slipping the device into my leather satchel. I spent the next 2 hours organizing the physical evidence. I took the printed medical affidavits, the financial ledgers tracking the offshore crypto transfers, the records of the Chicago Taylor purchases, and the handwriting analysis, arranging them into 3 pristine tabbed binders. Every page was categorized, cross-referenced, and secured. The digital clock on the bedside table read 6 in the morning. Outside, the bleak Iowa dawn was beginning to paint the frozen parking lot in shades of pale gray. I gathered my coat, threw my duffel bag over my shoulder, and walked out of room 7. I dropped the room key onto the front desk, walking past the sleeping night clerk without a word. The freezing morning air hit my face sharp and clearing. I climbed into my Honda, starting the engine and letting the heater run. As the windshield defrosted, my phone vibrated in the cup holder. It was another message from Arthur Davis, the estate lawyer. Elizabeth, the text read. Richard just called the office. He has formally requested armed security be present at the reading today. He intends to have you arrested for the theft of the vehicle if you arrive on the premises. Please advise on how you wish to proceed. I read the text, my hands resting on the steering wheel. Richard was obsessed with the optics of power. He wanted to humiliate me in the mahogany conference room, hoping to strip my dignity in front of the legal counsel. He thought the presence of security guards would intimidate me into surrendering the keys and walking away in disgrace. He was accelerating his own demise, demanding an audience for his final victory. I typed a brief, steady reply to the attorney. I understand, Mr. Davis. I will be there at 9 sharp. I shifted the car into drive, my tires crunching over the iced asphalt. The storm was no longer gathering on the horizon. It was here, and I was driving straight into the center of it. The sun crawled above the flat Iowa horizon, casting long, pale shadows across the frosted asphalt as I navigated the interstate toward downtown Des Moines. I kept the heater running high inside the cabin of my vehicle, fighting off the bitter morning chill. Resting on the passenger seat were the 3 tabbed binders I had assembled. They represented the sum total of my defensive strategy. But raw data is just information until an impartial authority authenticates it. Yesterday afternoon, while still confined to the drab motel room, I secured the services of an independent forensic accountant based in Omaha. I transmitted the encrypted ledgers, the offshore routing numbers, and the questionable transaction histories. The accountant required 6 grueling hours to parse the digital carnage. When he returned the verified documents, his attached message contained no dense legal jargon. He simply stated, "This is not routine mismanagement. This is systematic looting." He uncovered shell companies layered beneath shell companies, tracking the diverted hospice funds directly into offshore gambling syndicate accounts. He applied his official certification seal to the spreadsheets, transforming my private investigation into a court-admissible financial weapon. As I merged onto the inner city loop, the Bluetooth speaker system integrated into my dashboard chimed. The caller ID displayed the main office line for Davis & Partners. I tapped the steering wheel console to accept the connection. Arthur Davis possessed a voice cured by decades of reading testaments to grieving widows. Today, however, his usual measured baritone carried a tight edge of genuine anxiety. Elizabeth, he began skipping the standard pleasantries. Richard just arrived at the suite. He has escalated the parameters of this meeting. He formally requested armed security personnel be stationed inside the conference room. I kept my eyes on the highway traffic, watching the morning commuters weave between lanes. Why does he require guards for a standard probate reading? I asked. He intends to have you detained, Mr. Davis replied, the tension in his voice amplifying. He brought a printed copy of your vehicle registration. He plans to instruct the guards to hold you for the local police, citing grand theft of the Honda Civic the moment you step onto the premises. I advise you to reconsider your attendance. We can conduct your portion via remote video link to avoid a physical altercation. I thanked the elderly attorney for his caution and ended the call. A remote video link would provide physical safety, but it would also grant Richard the exact psychological victory he craved. My brother operated on the currency of intimidation. He was obsessed with the optics of power. He wanted me to cower behind a computer screen, or better yet, show up and be humiliated in the center of the mahogany conference room. He wanted to strip my dignity down to the floorboards in front of the legal counsel. He assumed the threat of handcuffs would break my nerve, causing me to surrender my leverage just to avoid a public scene. He was accelerating his own demise. He did not understand the profound internal shift that occurs when you finally accept the reality of your bloodline. I recalled the previous night in the motel. After organizing my binders and laying my gray blazer across the back of the wooden chair I lay down on the sagging mattress, I expected the familiar knot of familial guilt to twist in my stomach. I anticipated the insomnia that usually accompanies confrontation. Instead, I experienced a sensation of pure, cold clarity. I closed my eyes and slept for 8 solid hours. It was the deepest rest I had achieved since my mother received her terminal diagnosis. That restful sleep was the byproduct of acceptance. For 34 years, I carried the exhausting burden of hoping my family would eventually love me. I played the reliable daughter. I played the responsible medical proxy. I absorbed the slights, the financial drains, and the absentee siblings. I kept hoping my sacrifice would generate mutual respect. Lying in that motel room, I let that hope die. It was a necessary execution. You cannot negotiate with a predator while still holding on to the fantasy that they might become a protector. Once you accept that you must dismantle them to survive, the fear evaporates. The panic dissolves, leaving only the calculated mechanics of the operation. I took the downtown exit, navigating the one-way streets until the towering glass and steel architecture of the financial district rose around me. The law firm occupied the top floor of a restored historic bank building. The facade featured heavy stone pillars and brass revolving doors, projecting an aura of old money and untouchable authority. I guided the Honda into the adjacent underground parking garage. I found an empty spot near the elevator bank. I turned off the ignition and sat in the quiet cabin for a moment, letting the silence settle over me. This was the vehicle Richard intended to use as the catalyst for my arrest. He thought claiming ownership of a mid-sized sedan would serve as the ultimate demonstration of his executor muscle. I grabbed the keys, pulling them from the ignition. I reached deep into my purse, moving past my wallet and my phone until my fingers brushed against a secondary metallic ring hidden near the bottom lining. The rough, jagged edges of those alternate keys offered a grounding physical anchor. I gathered the 3 heavy binders from the passenger seat, holding them flush against my chest. I stepped out of the vehicle, locking the doors, and walking toward the concrete elevator vestibule. The morning air lingering in the subterranean structure held a damp, metallic chill. I ascended to the ground floor, traversing the polished terrazzo lobby. The security desk attendant nodded as I passed the towering marble columns. I pressed the call button for the executive elevator. The mirrored doors slid open, swallowing me into a silent, ascending box of brushed steel and soft instrumental music. With every floor, the digital display ticked higher, incrementing my proximity to the confrontation. My pulse remained steady. My breathing was even. The gray blazer felt crisp, serving as modern armor tailored for a corporate battlefield. The elevator chimed, arriving at the penthouse level. The doors parted, revealing a sprawling reception area, bathed in natural light from floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city's skyline. The scent of fresh roasted coffee and expensive lemon furniture polish permeated the conditioned air. A receptionist sitting behind a sweeping granite desk looked up, her eyes widening slightly as she recognized my face. She reached for her desk phone, likely instructed to alert the back rooms the moment I arrived on the floor. "You can tell them I am here," I said, my voice projecting a calm, flat authority. The receptionist nodded, her hand trembling slightly as she lifted the receiver. The storm was no longer gathering on the horizon. It had arrived, and I was ready to walk directly into the center of the wreckage. The heavy frosted glass doors separating the reception area from the inner sanctum of the law firm slid open. I walked down the long corridor, feeling the thick pile carpet absorb the sound of my footsteps. The corridor walls were lined with oil paintings of 19th century legal scholars, projecting an atmosphere of solemn tradition. I approached the double doors of the primary conference suite. I did not knock. I simply gripped the brass handles and pushed them open. The mahogany conference room was cavernous, spanning nearly 40 feet. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the frozen Iowa landscape stretching beyond the city grid. The air inside the room carried the sharp scent of lemon wood polish, mixed with the distinct cloying odor of unearned arrogance. Richard occupied the dominant chair positioned at the far head of the expansive table. He was wearing the bespoke navy blue suit, the fabric draped perfectly across his shoulders, radiating an expensive, tailored sheen. Looking at the lapels, my mind overlaid the digital transaction record. $3,000 siphoned directly from an operational fund designated to purchase morphine patches for a dying woman. He wore his mother's suffering like a corporate uniform. Stephanie sat to his immediate right. She perched on the edge of her leather chair, vibrating with a barely contained smug excitement. She had placed her oversized designer handbag directly onto the polished tabletop, a subtle territorial claim, indicating she already viewed the entire room and its contents as her personal property. Flanking the entrance stood two large men dressed in identical dark gray tactical uniforms. They were private security contractors built like linebackers, with earpieces curled tightly around the cartilage of their ears. They shifted their weight the moment I crossed the threshold, crossing their arms across their broad chests, forming a physical barrier between myself and the exit. Arthur Davis sat at the midpoint of the long table. The elderly attorney looked exhausted. A stack of thick legal binders rested in front of him, forming a defensive barricade of paper and precedent. He adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses, gesturing vaguely toward the empty chair positioned at the extreme opposite end of the table, directly facing Richard. I walked the length of the room, ignoring the security contractors. I pulled back the heavy leather chair and sat down. I did not arrange my 3 binders on the table. I kept them stacked neatly in my lap, an unassuming block of condensed data resting beneath the sightline of my brother. Mr. Davis cleared his throat, a dry, raspy sound that echoed in the cavernous space. He opened the top binder, peeling back the heavy cardstock cover. "We are convened this morning to formally execute the final testament of Caroline Anderson," the lawyer began, his voice finding its measured, professional cadence. "The primary document submitted for probate is an updated addendum executed 3 weeks prior to the decedent's passing." The attorney did not look up from the page. He knew the document was a crude, midnight forgery. He knew the signature was extracted through coercion. But in the theater of probate law, until a formal injunction is filed, the text on the page commands the room. "I will read the core distribution directives into the formal record," Mr. Davis continued, turning the page. "To my son Richard, I leave the entirety of the Anderson family estate. This includes the primary residential structure, the 400-acre surrounding property, and all existing liquid assets held within the family trust." The words hung in the air, heavy and final. Richard leaned back, his posture expanding to fill the executive chair. He laced his fingers together, resting his hands over his stomach. He locked eyes with me. The mask of the grieving son evaporated entirely, replaced by a vicious, triumphant sneer. He had won the war of attrition. The legal authority was now his. He possessed the land, the house, and the bank accounts. "Hope you enjoy being homeless, Elizabeth," he mocked. His voice was loud, designed to carry across the polished wood and bounce off the glass walls, ensuring the security guards and the attorney heard every syllable of my degradation. I sat perfectly still, allowing his voice to fill the space. "Because I made sure you get nothing," Richard continued, his tone dripping with a toxic blend of pity and superiority. "You spent 3 years acting like you owned that property, acting like you were the cornerstone of this family. But you were always just the hired help anyway, and now your shift is over." Stephanie giggled softly, covering her mouth with her manicured hand. The diamond solitaire on her ring finger flashed under the recessed overhead lighting. It was the same hand, the same ring, that I had watched guide my mother's limp fingers across the signature line at 2 a.m. She was laughing at the success of her own criminal architecture. Mr. Davis shifted uncomfortably in his seat, looking down at his legal pad. He was bound by professional decorum, forced to facilitate this hostile transfer of power. Richard unlaced his fingers and leaned forward, resting his elbows aggressively on the mahogany surface. He was not satisfied with simply claiming the sprawling estate. He required immediate, tangible submission. He wanted to watch me surrender a physical object in front of an audience. "Now," Richard demanded, extending his open right palm across the table, pointing the gesture directly at me. "Hand over the keys to the Honda." The demand was petty, but calculated. He knew I had driven the vehicle to the law firm. He knew taking my transportation would leave me stranded on the downtown pavement, forcing me to call a cab or walk to a bus stop, hauling my duffel bag like a vagrant. "The estate paid for that vehicle 3 years ago," he stated, his voice hardening into a command. "It belongs to the trust. Therefore, it is mine. Put the keys on the table, Elizabeth, or I will instruct these gentlemen to detain you for grand theft right now." He gestured toward the 2 large security contractors standing by the door. One of the guards took a half step forward, his hand resting near his tactical belt. The threat of physical restraint hung heavy in the conditioned air. Richard stared at me, his open palm waiting, expecting me to break, expecting me to reach into my purse with trembling hands and surrender my only means of escape. He had built a fortress of intimidation, utilizing forged documents, stolen money, and hired muscle to corner me. But intimidation only functions if the target fears the consequences. I did not fear losing the vehicle. I did not fear the security guards. I feared nothing inside that room. Because my brother fundamentally misunderstood the concept of ownership. He believed the paperwork drafted in the middle of the night granted him ultimate authority over the physical world. He was about to learn that true leverage resides in the meticulous architecture of the supply chain. I reached into my dark leather purse, bypassing my wallet and my phone. My fingers curled around a heavy ring of keys resting near the bottom lining. I gripped the cold, jagged metal, pulling them from the depths of the bag. The minor conflict had reached its peak. It was time to introduce the decoy. I did not flinch. I did not break eye contact with my brother. I brought my hand up from beneath the table holding the heavy metallic cluster. With a flick of my wrist, I tossed the ring across the 40-foot expanse of polished mahogany. The metal skittered across the smooth wood, spinning rapidly before clattering directly against Richard's outstretched palm. He snatched the cluster out of the air, his fingers curling tight around the metal. He grinned, his teeth flashing in the overhead light. It was the feral smile of a man who believed he had just crushed his only remaining opposition. He looked at Stephanie, shooting her a triumphant sideways glance, validating his own ruthless tactics. Then he looked down at his closed fist. He slowly uncurled his fingers to inspect his prize. His smile evaporated instantly, replaced by a stark, sudden confusion. Resting in the center of his manicured palm was not a sleek black electronic key fob bearing a Japanese automotive logo. He held 3 crude, jagged brass keys strung together on a piece of frayed wire. The metal was pitted, coated in a thin, stubborn layer of dried mud and oxidized rust. "What is this?" he snapped, his confusion rapidly curdling into anger. "You asked for estate property," I replied, my voice remaining perfectly even, devoid of any emotional inflection. "I bought the Honda Civic 3 years ago, using a commercial vehicle lease. The title is registered to a private logistics LLC, operating under my personal tax identification number. Our parents never held equity in the sedan. The keys currently residing in your hand, however, belong to the 1998 Ford diesel tractor parked inside the rear maintenance barn." I paused, allowing the reality of the rusted metal to sink in. "You can keep the tractor," I added, keeping my tone completely deadpan. "It requires a new alternator." The color drained from Richard's face, then rushed back in a violent flush of deep crimson. He had orchestrated this entire theatrical moment to humiliate me. He had hired security guards to witness my submission. Instead, I had tossed him the garbage of the estate, exposing his total ignorance regarding the basic operational assets of the family property. He slammed his fist against the mahogany surface. The impact echoed like a gunshot in the cavernous room, the brass teeth of the tractor keys digging sharply into his own palm. "Mr. Davis," he barked, his voice cracking an octave higher, betraying his rising panic. "I want her removed from this facility. Have these guards detain her for grand theft right now. She is stealing corporate assets." The 2 large security contractors standing near the double doors shifted their weight, moving away from the wall. The taller guard took 2 heavy steps forward, his hand dropping toward the tactical radio clipped to his belt, preparing to execute the physical removal order. The atmosphere in the room tightened, stretching like a wire about to snap. Richard was attempting to substitute legal authority with brute physical force. Arthur Davis raised a single open-hand palm facing the approaching guards. The gesture was small, but it carried the weight of 4 decades of jurisprudence. The security contractors stopped instantly, freezing their advance. They were hired muscle, but they understood the hierarchy of a law firm. The senior partner commands the room. The elderly lawyer adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses, pushing them higher onto the bridge of his nose. He looked down the length of the long table, analyzing the tableau. He observed Richard's flushed, enraged face, his chest heaving under the expensive tailored suit. Then the lawyer shifted his gaze toward my end of the table, observing the cold stillness of my posture, my hands resting quietly in my lap above the hidden binders. Mr. Davis understood the precise mechanics of power. He recognized that the person screaming demands rarely controls the battlefield. The true authority resides with the individual who anticipates the scream and prepares the countermeasure. "Richard, please sit back down in your chair," Mr. Davis instructed. His voice had lost the measured cadence of the initial reading. It dropped into a low, gravelly register carrying a sharp, undeniable command. I and the executor Richard spat, leaning over the table, refusing to retreat. "She just admitted to hiding vehicles under shell corporations. I want her arrested." "You will not instruct security to lay hands on a beneficiary inside my firm," Mr. Davis replied, his tone slicing through the hysteria. "If you attempt to initiate a physical altercation in this suite, I will immediately file an injunction to revoke your fiduciary status pending a judicial review. Sit down." Richard glared at the attorney, his jaw working furiously. He realized the lawyer was not a hired subordinate willing to bend to his tantrums. He slowly sank back into the heavy leather executive chair, his posture stiff, his hands gripping the armrests. He tossed the rusted tractor keys onto the table, pushing them away as if they were contaminated. Stephanie reached over, placing her hand on his forearm, attempting to project a united front, but her grip looked tight, anxious. The script they had written for this morning was unraveling. "Fine," Richard muttered, his eyes darting toward the floor-to-ceiling windows. "Read the rest of the boilerplate closing language so I can secure the final decrees and get her out of my house." Mr. Davis did not reach for the stack of closing decrees. Instead, he reached toward the very bottom of his formidable legal barricade. He extracted a thin blue manila envelope resting beneath the primary trust documents. He pulled a single document from the envelope, placing it squarely in the center of his desk pad. "There is no boilerplate language remaining regarding the primary trust distribution," Mr. Davis announced, the silence returning to the cavernous space. However, the reading is not concluded. Richard blinked his brow, furrowing. "What else is there?" he demanded, his voice losing its aggressive edge, sounding genuinely bewildered. The addendum stated, "I own the house. I own the land. I hold the liquid assets. She is out. There is nothing left to distribute." The elderly lawyer looked at Richard over the top rim of his glasses, offering a glance that bordered on profound pity. "The addendum you submitted dictates the transfer of the residential estate and the associated personal trust," Mr. Davis clarified, tapping his pen against the legal pad. "But we must now address the commercial assets." "Commercial assets?" Stephanie echoed, her voice thin, tight. "What commercial assets?" Mr. Davis ignored her question, keeping his focus entirely on my brother. "There is one final section to this probate execution," the lawyer stated. "It is a legally binding codicil, executed 2 full years prior to the decedent's passing. This specific codicil was drafted, sealed, and registered with the State Commerce Board. Therefore, it supersedes any and all subsequent addendums regarding the disposition of the surrounding property." The word "supersedes" landed like a physical blow. Richard's arrogant posture collapsed. He leaned forward, his eyes locked on the thin document resting on the attorney's desk. The minor conflict regarding the stolen vehicle evaporated entirely, replaced by a massive structural threat to his newly acquired empire. The foundation he thought he had secured the night he forged his mother's signature was about to be ripped out from underneath him. It was time to reveal the true architecture of the estate. Richard scoffed a harsh, dismissive sound that fell flat in the quiet expanse of the conference room. He shifted in the heavy executive chair, trying to reconstruct his aura of untouchable authority. He looked at the elderly attorney with a mixture of pity and irritation, treating the senior partner like an incompetent subordinate who had misplaced a file. "What else is there?" Richard demanded, his voice returning to its familiar, arrogant pitch. "I own the house. I own the land. I hold the liquid assets. She is out. There is nothing left to distribute, Mr. Davis. You are wasting my time with archival paperwork." Arthur Davis did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The attorney simply smoothed the single sheet of paper resting on his desk pad, aligning the edges with meticulous care. He adjusted his glasses and looked directly at my brother. "You hold the liquid assets residing in the personal family trust," the lawyer corrected, his tone clinical and precise. "You possess the deed to the primary residential structure. However, the surrounding property and the associated operational ventures are no longer subject to probate distribution." Stephanie dropped her gaze to the table. The smug excitement that had animated her features only moments prior vanished. Her manicured fingers tightened around the strap of her designer handbag, her knuckles turning a pale ivory. She lacked her husband's blinding ego, meaning she possessed the capacity to recognize a structural threat before it made impact. Mr. Davis cleared his throat and began reading from the codicil. 2 years ago, William and Caroline Anderson initiated a comprehensive corporate restructuring. They transferred all commercial deeds, the 400 acres of agricultural land, and the entirety of the Anderson logistics business into a newly formed private entity designated as Anderson Legacy Holdings. The words hung in the conditioned air. For 3 generations, our family had farmed that specific tract of Iowa soil. My grandfather eventually expanded the operation, purchasing 3 diesel trucks to transport regional grain yields. Over the past decade, while Richard was living in Chicago burning through seed money for imaginary tech ventures, I utilized my supply chain degree to scale that local trucking route into a regional logistics firm. I managed the dispatch software, I negotiated the vendor contracts, and I kept the operation profitable. My parents recognized who was building the legacy and who was waiting to liquidate it. Richard blinked rapidly, his brow furrowing as he tried to process the legal terminology. His entire adult life was built on a foundation of hollow buzzwords and borrowed equity. His business vocabulary failed him when confronted with actual corporate governance. So what Richard argued, waving his hand in the air as if swatting away a minor annoyance, I inherit the estate. The estate encompasses all associated family enterprises. Therefore, I inherit the holding company. It is a simple, hierarchical transfer. He leaned back, crossing his arms over his chest, waiting for the lawyer to confirm his flawed assumption. He believed the executor title acted as a skeleton key, granting him blanket dominion over every corporate entity bearing our surname. He fundamentally misunderstood the anatomy of the assets he was trying to steal. Mr. Davis opened his mouth to clarify the legal boundary, but I did not let him speak. The time for proxy negotiations had passed. "No, Richard," I said, projecting my voice down the 40-foot length of the mahogany table. My brother snapped his attention toward me, his eyes narrowing. "Inheriting the estate means you inherit the physical structure of the residential house," I explained. My tone devoid of anger, keeping the delivery cold and measured. "You own the drywall, you own the roofing shingles, you own the hardwood floors and the living room carpets." I reached down and lifted the thickest of my 3 tabbed binders. I placed it squarely on the table, sliding it across the polished wood. The heavy binder glided smoothly, coming to a halt just inches from his steepled fingers. "Open it," I instructed. Richard stared at the binder as if it were a dormant explosive. He uncrossed his arms, reaching out with hesitant fingers to flip open the heavy cardstock cover. The first page displayed a certified document bearing the raised gold seal of the Iowa State Corporate Registry. Our parents did not own the holding company. I continued, watching his eyes scan the certified text. Therefore, the holding company cannot be transferred to you through a probate addendum, regardless of who forged the signature. Stephanie flinched at the word forged, her gaze darting toward the security guards to see if they had registered the accusation. Richard ignored the jab, his eyes locked on the state registry seal. "They sold the holding company to me," I stated, letting the reality of the transaction settle over the room. 2 years ago, for a fair market value of $2.5 million. The color drained from Richard's face. The bespoke suit suddenly looked too large for his shoulders. His jaw went slack, his mouth opening slightly as he struggled to draw air into his lungs. When my mother gripped my wrist in the hospital, demanding I protect the farm from his debts, I knew a simple inheritance clause would not survive a hostile legal challenge. If my parents gifted me the land, Richard would sue the estate, claiming undue influence, trapping the property in litigation for a decade. The only way to build an impenetrable fortress was to remove the assets from the probate process entirely. I secured a commercial loan leveraging my corporate salary and my proven operational control of the logistics firm. I paid our parents $2.5 million, acquiring sole ownership of Anderson Legacy Holdings. The capital injection funded their hospice care, their medical equipment, and the very accounts Richard had recently drained. He thought he was stealing their retirement savings. He was actually stealing the purchase money I had paid to secure my own empire. "I own the land," I said, watching the realization fracture his arrogant facade. "I own the 400 acres of soil surrounding your house. I own the logistics business, the maintenance barns, and the commercial fleet." Richard looked up from the binder, his eyes wide and hollow. He was performing the geographical math in his head, mapping the physical reality of his newly acquired inheritance. "And I own the driveway leading up to your front door," I concluded. The silence in the conference room became absolute. The high-altitude view from the floor-to-ceiling windows framed the sprawling city below, but Richard was trapped on an island of his own making. He had rushed the legal clock to evict me, demanding the deed to the primary residence be transferred to his name immediately. He had succeeded. He now possessed a massive, aging farmhouse sitting squarely in the center of 400 acres of prime agricultural real estate that belonged entirely to me. He was legally, physically, and logistically landlocked. Stephanie slumped back in her leather chair, the designer bag sliding off the table and hitting the carpet with a dull thud. The opulent lifestyle she envisioned, the grand estate she planned to sell to commercial developers to cover their hidden debts, had just evaporated. She had committed federal forgery to inherit a worthless perimeter of drywall surrounded by hostile territory. Richard stared at the state registry seal, his chest rising and falling in rapid, shallow increments. The psychological shock of the codicil stripped away his polished exterior, leaving behind the desperate, erratic energy of a cornered animal. He realized his brute force strategy had failed. He had been outmaneuvered by an opponent who understood that true power does not reside in screaming demands, but in securing the supply chain. But a desperate man rarely accepts defeat gracefully. When the primary route is destroyed, a drowning operator will grab at the nearest piece of floating debris. Richard's hollow expression warped, twisting into a feral grimace of panicked rage. He pushed the heavy binder away from him, sending it skidding back across the mahogany surface. He dropped his hands to the floor, reaching for his leather briefcase, resting near the leg of his chair. His fingers fumbled with the brass latches, the metal clicking frantically in the quiet room. He had anticipated resistance. He had brought a secondary weapon, a crude contingency plan drafted in the shadows of his failing marriage. He snapped the briefcase open and reached inside, preparing to introduce a new fabrication designed to chain me to his sinking ship. His fingers fumbled with the brass latches, the metal clicking frantically in the quiet room. He had anticipated resistance. He had brought a secondary weapon, a crude contingency plan drafted in the shadows of his failing marriage. He snapped the briefcase open and reached inside, preparing to introduce a new fabrication designed to chain me to his sinking ship. "This is fraud!" Richard screamed. Saliva flew from his lips, spotting the polished mahogany surface. He yanked a single sheet of crumpled paper from the leather depths of the briefcase. He slammed the document onto the table, sliding it hard toward Arthur Davis. The paper slid across the wood, coming to a halt against the base of the lawyer's penholder. "I have a promissory note right here," he shouted, his voice echoing against the glass walls, bouncing back with a shrill, desperate edge. Mom signed it. It clearly outlines the financial deficit. It states Elizabeth owes the estate $500,000 for unpaid rent and misappropriated utilities spanning her 3-year occupancy of the guest house. I understood the mechanical logic behind his panic. He was attempting to create a toxic asset. He realized he could not touch the holding company or the 400 acres of soil. But if he could manufacture a legally binding debt, forcing me to owe the family trust $500,000, the liability would cripple my logistics company. He assumed a massive debt burden would force me to liquidate the land. He thought he could corner me into trading the acreage just to clear the fabricated ledger. It was a backup plan born of sheer, raw desperation. Mr. Davis adjusted his glasses, pulling the crumpled paper closer to his chest. The elderly lawyer scrutinized the document. He did not need a handwriting expert or a forensic analyst to identify the forgery. The ink was smeared. The legal phrasing resembled a generic contract downloaded from a cheap internet template. The signature, resting at the bottom of the page, was rigid, tracing the same unnatural strokes found on the midnight will and the fake eviction notice. "Look at the signature," Richard insisted, leaning over the table and tapping the paper with his index finger. "She owes the trust. She drained the resources, living rent-free. As the executor of this estate, I am officially calling in the debt today." I did not even look at the document. Glancing at a fabrication grants it a shadow of legitimacy. Reacting to a lie tells the liar their tactic is working. I kept my posture relaxed, leaning back in the heavy leather chair. I reached into my satchel resting on the floor beside my feet and retrieved my laptop. I set the sleek silver device on the table, lifting the screen. The machine powered on, casting a pale blue glow across my face. "That is a fascinating piece of paper, Richard," I said, keeping my tone conversational, cold, and steady. "Because I brought my own reading material today. I have the audited ledgers from the estate spanning the last 36 months. I tapped the spacebar. The screen woke up instantly, displaying the exact file the independent forensic accountant had transmitted from Omaha. I gripped the aluminum edge of the laptop and turned the device around, facing the bright, high-definition display directly toward my brother and his wife. A sprawling, color-coded spreadsheet filled the monitor. Rows of meticulous data stood organized in stark, undeniable columns. It was a digital map of their avarice, verified, certified, and court-admissible. This matrix tracks every single wire transfer, every ATM withdrawal, and every external capital injection bleeding out of the family operational accounts over the last 3 years, I explained. The accountant verified the outflow patterns, adding his official state certification seal to the findings. The total extracted capital equals $680,000. Richard stopped tapping the fake promissory note. His hand hovered over the table, freezing in midair. The air in the room grew thick, heavy, with the sudden gravity of empirical evidence. I directed my attention to the screen, pointing to the corresponding highlighted sections. Let us review the primary destinations I suggested, letting my voice carry the measured authority of a corporate audit. We can start with the offshore channels. Multiple inbound transfers routing through Miami-based crypto exchanges utilizing digital tumbling software. Those maneuvers account for $150,000 alone. Stephanie swallowed hard, the sound audible in the quiet, tense room. She knew about the crypto transfers. They had planned those specific extractions together, huddled in their Chicago apartment, rationalizing the theft as early inheritance. I moved my finger down the screen, tracking the next sequence of data. Next, we find 3 separate luxury car leases registered to shell entities operating out of Illinois. Those vehicles were secured using our parents' Social Security numbers as collateral guarantees, shielding your personal credit score from the liability. Richard opened his mouth to formulate a denial, but his voice failed. His throat was too dry. The data was dissecting him, performing a public autopsy on his financial history. He could scream fraud all he wanted, but he could not outrun the routing numbers. And finally, I continued returning my focus to the bespoke, tailored fabric draping his shoulders. We have a $3,000 point-of-sale charge at a downtown Chicago tailor. The transaction cleared the exact morning our mother passed away. You are currently wearing the stolen hospice funds, Richard. You brought security guards to arrest me for driving my own vehicle while you are sitting in a stolen suit. The 2 security contractors standing near the double doors exchanged a subtle, sidelong glance. They were hired to protect an executive from an unruly sibling. They were slowly realizing they were actually guarding a cornered felon from a forensic execution. The power dynamic had inverted so fast it left a vacuum in the room. Stephanie leaned forward, her designer faux fur coat brushing against the mahogany table. She squinted at the bright laptop screen, her eyes scanning the meticulous rows of verified data. She had helped engineer the midnight forgery. She had guided the pen across the legal documents. She believed she understood the full scope of their criminal enterprise. She thought they were stealing to support their shared lifestyle, to maintain the illusion of their urban success. But a man who steals from his dying mother rarely operates with total transparency toward his spouse. Liars build their foundations on shifting sand, constructing hidden compartments to conceal their private failures, even from their co-conspirators. Stephanie traced the data lines, tracking the flow of capital. Her gaze drifted past the car leases and the crypto exchanges. She noticed a distinct cluster of recurring outbound payments, highlighted in a deep, severe crimson. The payments were large, frequent, and routed to an entity she did not recognize. Her eyes widened. The smug confidence that had defined her features since she shut off my power in the frozen Iowa winter evaporated. A look of sheer, stark horror replaced it, washing the color from her cheeks. "Richard," she whispered, her voice shaking, carrying a fragile, brittle edge. "What is the Vegas Capital line item?" The temperature in the conference room seemed to plummet. The dramatic irony peaked, settling over the table like a suffocating blanket. I knew exactly what that specific line item represented. The forensic accountant had traced the routing numbers, digging through the corporate shell structure until he exposed the true recipient. Vegas Capital was not a tech incubator or a legitimate investment firm. It was a secondary lending institution specializing in high-risk, collateralized debt. It was the financial graveyard where desperate men buried their gambling losses. Richard knew exactly what it was, too. The moment his wife read the words aloud, his face turned the color of wet ash. The bravado, the sneering superiority, the demands for immediate arrest, all of it vanished. He looked at Stephanie with wide, terrified eyes, resembling a man standing on the trapdoor of a gallows, listening to the wooden lever being pulled. He had kept this specific secret buried deep in the dark. He thought his offshore routing and his digital tumbling software would shield his private ruin from the woman sitting next to him. But the spreadsheet laid bare every hidden transaction, stripping away the camouflage. He had not just mortgaged his parents' future, he had leveraged his own marriage. Stephanie turned her head, staring at her husband. Her manicured fingers dug into the edge of the mahogany wood, her knuckles turning white under the strain. She did not ask the question a second time. She demanded the answer. "I said, what is the Vegas Capital line item, Richard? Tell me right now." The facade of their united front fractured, splintering under the weight of the undeniable evidence. They were no longer co-conspirators hunting a shared target. The forensic nuke had detonated inside their marriage, exposing a secondary layer of profound betrayal that Stephanie never anticipated. The conflict was mutating, shifting from a battle over a landlocked estate into a vicious internal reckoning. I sat back in my heavy leather chair, resting my hands quietly in my lap. I did not need to speak. The trap had sprung, its steel jaws snapping shut. I just needed to sit in the silence and watch the predators turn their teeth upon each other. "Shut up, Steph," Richard snapped. His voice was no longer commanding. It carried a desperate, ragged pitch resembling the sound of fabric ripping under strain. He lunged across the polished mahogany, attempting to physically seize the aluminum chassis of my laptop. He wanted to kill the monitor, plunging the room back into ignorance. He thought blinding the screen would somehow erase the financial reality projecting onto his wife's face. I did not let go. I locked my grip around the base of the machine, holding it firm against the heavy wooden table. The display remained illuminated, casting its harsh blue light across the fractured facade of their marriage. "The Vegas Capital line item," I stated, keeping my voice perfectly level, letting the syllables cut through the rising chaos of the room. I bypassed Richard entirely, directing my words straight to Stephanie. That specific recurring extraction is not an offshore investment account. It is a secondary mortgage. Richard secretly leveraged the equity on your primary residence in downtown Chicago, utilizing the capital to cover catastrophic losses incurred through an offshore sports betting syndicate. Stephanie stopped breathing. The air left her lungs in a hollow rush. Her eyes remained fixed on the glowing spreadsheet tracking the red ledger entries, mapping the destruction of her own urban sanctuary. "The bank initiated foreclosure proceedings on your townhome 14 days ago, Stephanie." I continued, delivering the final clinical blow. "The eviction notice you tried to serve me yesterday was a projection of your own impending reality. Your house is gone." Stephanie stood up. The movement was so abrupt, so violently sudden, that her heavy leather chair tipped backward, crashing against the thick carpet with a dull, resounding thud. "You told me the house was paid off," she shrieked, her voice shattering the dignified silence of the legal suite. She turned on her husband, batting his hands away as he frantically tried to grasp her forearm. "You looked me in the eyes and said the tech startup secured full Series A funding. You said the property was clear. You swore we were liquid." "I did not want to worry you," Steph Richards stammered, shrinking back into his seat. His bespoke suit suddenly looked pathetic, hanging off the frame of a cornered liar. The market shifted. The venture capital pulled back at the last minute. I just needed to float the margins. I needed a bridge loan to keep the optics solid until the estate transferred. I was fixing it. I was going to pay it back. "You gambled our equity on a bridge loan," she screamed, stepping closer, looming over his chair. "You leveraged my name, my credit, my home. You swore the offshore accounts were holding our inheritance." The united front, the coordinated arrogance they had worn like armor when they marched up my driveway with a locksmith, splintered into 1,000 jagged pieces. They were no longer the executor and the loyal spouse executing a hostile takeover. They were two desperate operators realizing they had tied themselves to a sinking anchor. The conference room transformed into a theater of mutual destruction. They yelled over each other, hurling accusations, uncovering years of private financial deception right in front of the estate attorney and the two bewildered security contractors. I sat back watching the implosion. In logistics, you learn that poorly constructed supply chains do not require external demolition. They collapse under the weight of their own internal friction. You simply apply pressure to the weak points and step out of the impact zone. But I was not finished. The structural collapse was underway, but I needed to ensure Stephanie understood the precise legal gravity of her own participation. She could not walk away claiming the status of an unwitting victim. She had actively engineered the forgery. She had guided the pen. She had to carry her portion of the liability. "And Stephanie," I added, speaking softly. My tone dropped barely above a whisper, yet it carried through the screaming, cutting through their escalating argument with surgical precision. She stopped yelling, snapping her attention back toward my end of the table. Her chest heaved, her manicured hands trembling at her sides. "Before you attempt to claim innocence, I suggest you evaluate your own exposure," I said, sliding the second heavy binder across the mahogany wood. I ran a formal forensic handwriting analysis utilizing the forged probate addendum and the pseudo-legal eviction notice you handed me on the front lawn. I tapped the thick cardstock cover of the binder. The biometric alignment is identical. The pressure strokes, the arch trajectory, the spacing between the vowels, all match your specific handwriting patterns perfectly. The analysis confirms you were the primary architect of the forgery. Stephanie's mouth opened, but no sound emerged. The realization hit her with the physical force of a sledgehammer. She had orchestrated a midnight crime, believing her husband possessed the legal intellect to shield her. She forged a signature to save a lifestyle that her husband had already secretly gambled away. She had committed a federal offense for an empty bank account. "You forged our mother's signature while she lay dying," I stated, summarizing the reality of her actions for the formal record. Forging a legal document to extract capital from an active trust constitutes federal wire fraud and elder abuse. You are not a victim in this scenario, Stephanie. You are a co-conspirator facing criminal indictment. I highly suggest you stop screaming at your husband and secure your own independent legal counsel immediately. The silence that followed was absolute. The screaming ceased. The air felt heavy, suffocating, carrying the distinct metallic scent of total ruin. Stephanie looked at Richard. She saw a man who had lied about their home, lied about their wealth, and dragged her into a federal felony. She saw a failure wrapped in a $3,000 suit. She did not yell anymore. She did not argue. She simply leaned down, snatching her oversized designer bag off the floor. She turned on her heel, her designer shoes clicking sharply against the polished wood, and stormed out of the conference room. The heavy frosted glass doors swung shut behind her, leaving a cold draft in her wake. Richard sat alone at the head of the table. The man who had walked into the room demanding an arrest, demanding submission, demanding keys, now sat shivering in the wreckage of his own design. He had lost his wife. He had lost his home. He had lost the 400 acres of soil. Mr. Davis picked up his water glass, taking a slow, measured sip. The elderly attorney looked thoroughly unimpressed, observing Richard with the detached, clinical gaze of a man who spent 40 years watching greed dismantle families. The security guards shifted their weight, exchanging nervous glances, unsure of their current protocol. They were hired to escort a trespasser out of the building. Instead, they were guarding a broken man staring blankly at a legal binder. I reached forward, closing the lid of my laptop. The blue glow vanished, returning the room to the flat, natural light spilling through the floor-to-ceiling windows. I had dismantled his physical perimeter. I had dismantled his marriage. I had dismantled his legal authority. But a true siege requires total, comprehensive neutralization. You do not leave the opposing operator with a functioning communication network. You cut the lines. You isolate the target entirely. As I placed the laptop into my leather satchel, a sharp buzzing sound vibrated against the mahogany table. My phone illuminated, displaying a notification from the encrypted messaging application I used to communicate with the extended family network. The minor conflict inside the conference room had peaked and resolved. It was time for the final escalation. The private destruction was complete. It was time to initiate the public execution. The heavy frosted glass doors settled into their tracks, sealing the conference suite in a profound quiet. The echo of Stephanie's designer heels faded down the outer corridor, leaving a hollow vacuum inside the room. Richard sat paralyzed at the head of the mahogany table. He stared at the empty chair beside him, unable to process the velocity of his own ruin. He had orchestrated this meeting to finalize an empire. Instead, he watched his primary co-conspirator flee the premises to secure a criminal defense attorney. Before Richard could formulate a single word, a sharp, mechanical hum shattered the silence. His smartphone rested near his right elbow on the polished wood. The screen illuminated, casting a pale glow across the ceiling. The device vibrated. A brief chime sounded. 2 seconds later, a second chime rang out. Then a third. Then a rapid, relentless sequence of notifications began to pour in, overlapping each other in a chaotic digital symphony. Richard possessed a specific methodology for handling crises. He preferred to control the narrative window. I knew his post-meeting strategy involved calling the extended family network to spin a calculated tale of victimhood. He likely planned to frame me as a bitter, unstable sibling trying to steal the estate, requiring him to take swift executive action to protect our parents' legacy. He operated on the assumption that whoever delivered the news first owned the truth. I understood that strategy. In logistics, preempting a bottleneck requires deploying accurate data ahead of the anticipated disruption. While Richard and Stephanie were tearing their marriage apart, screaming over foreclosed townhomes and hidden gambling debts, my hands were resting quietly in my lap, operating my own cellular device. I opened the encrypted messaging application holding the primary family group chat. The network included our aunts, uncles, and adult cousins. I did not type a lengthy emotional explanation. I did not hurl accusations. I simply uploaded 3 high-resolution image files to the shared thread and pressed send. The first image displayed the outbound routing receipt detailing the $42,000 wire transfer. The document highlighted the timestamp, matching the exact morning our mother drew her final breath. Cross-referenced with the destination coordinates of the Miami Offshore Exchange. The second image featured the forensic handwriting slide. It positioned the forged signature from the probate addendum directly adjacent to Stephanie's handwriting on the pseudo-legal eviction notice, circling the identical biometric pressure strokes. The third image delivered the most devastating payload. Our grandfather spent 40 years working the assembly line at a regional tractor implement factory. He lived a frugal existence, saving a modest portion of every paycheck to establish uniform, custodial education accounts for his youngest grandchildren. He wanted to ensure the next generation bypassed the financial struggles he endured. 2 years ago, Richard utilized his status as a financial advisor to convince our extended relatives to consolidate those specific college funds under his direct management. He promised to reinvest the capital into a high-yield technology portfolio, guaranteeing exponential growth for the cousins' tuitions. The third screenshot consisted of the audited ledger, proving Richard liquidated those custodial accounts within 48 hours of receiving the transfer. He routed every single dollar directly into the Vegas Capital's secondary lending institution. Stealing from a dying parent is a profound moral failure. Liquidating the educational future of innocent children to cover an offshore sports betting deficit is an act of unforgivable predation. Richard's smartphone vibrated so intensely it began inching across the smooth mahogany surface. The notifications transformed into a continuous, unbroken chime. He reached out with a trembling hand and picked up the device. He unlocked the screen. I watched his eyes track the incoming text. The ambient light from the phone reflected in his pupils. I did not need to see the screen to know the contents of the messages. The family network the people Richard relied upon for admiration, validation, and periodic emergency loans was mutating into a digital firing squad. Uncle Greg operated a hardware dealership in Omaha. He was a stern, unforgiving man who worshipped our grandfather. The text alert bearing his name popped onto the screen, typed entirely in capital letters. I watched Richard's throat work, performing a dry, painful swallow as he read the words. Uncle Greg was promising to contact the federal authorities before the lunch hour ended. He demanded to know the exact location of his daughter's tuition money. Aunt Susan followed immediately. She typed a rapid succession of messages demanding full, immediate restitution. She promised to file a civil suit, placing a lien on any asset bearing Richard's name. The cousins chimed in, expressing a mixture of profound disgust and pure rage. The social currency Richard spent decades cultivating cratered in real time. He always portrayed himself as the sophisticated urban entrepreneur, returning to the rural Midwest to guide his unsophisticated relatives. The spreadsheets stripped away the costume. He was exposed as a common thief hunting inside his own perimeter. Richard lowered the phone. The device slipped from his weak grip, landing face up on the table, still illuminating the ceiling with an endless stream of incoming wrath. The physical transformation of his posture was startling. The inflated, arrogant chest collapsed inward, his shoulders rounded, curling forward toward the table. The tailored navy blue suit wrinkled, bunching awkwardly around his neck. The blood drained entirely from his face, leaving his skin a sickly pale gray. The sweat gathered along his hairline, catching the recessed overhead lighting. Arthur Davis observed the collapse with detached, professional patience. The elderly attorney closed the primary legal binder, folding his hands over the leather cover. The two security contractors standing by the double doors shifted uncomfortably, realizing they were witnessing a man being erased from his own life. Richard looked across the 40-foot expanse of the conference table. He looked at me. The vicious sneer, the condescending smirk, the demands for my immediate arrest, all of those weapons lay shattered on the floor. He possessed no remaining leverage. His wife abandoned him. The law firm rejected his authority. The family network was preparing to hunt him. The offshore accounts were empty. His eyes met mine. They were hollow, rimmed with a raw, panicked red. They were the eyes of a cornered prey animal, realizing the trap contained no exit. "Elizabeth," he whispered. His voice broke, cracking on the syllables. He cleared his throat and tried again, the sound barely carrying across the room. "Elizabeth, please." He leaned forward, pressing his palms flat against the mahogany, gripping the edges as if the table were the only buoyant object in a rising ocean. "I am broke," he confessed, the words tumbling out in a rushed, desperate breath. "I'm broke. The venture capital is gone. The house in Chicago is gone. I have nothing left. Greg is going to call the feds. Susan is going to sue me. If the bank runs a background check on the offshore routing, they will find the fraud. I will go to prison." He paused, dragging a ragged breath into his lungs. He was cycling through the final stages of grief, bypassing denial and plunging straight into bargaining. "Buy the house from me," he begged. He pointed a shaking finger toward the window, indicating the unseen estate located miles away. You own the land around it. You own the logistics company. You have the capital. The residential structure sits right in the middle of your acreage. It makes sense for you to own the whole grid. His logic was frantic, built on a foundation of sheer terror. He assumed the physical house held intrinsic, sentimental, or geographic value to me. I will sell you the estate right now. He offered, the pitch rising in his throat. Today, we can draft the transfer paperwork before we leave this room. I will sign over the deed to the primary residence for $1 million cash. Just give me the liquidity. Bail me out. Give me enough capital to pay Greg back and clear the Vegas ledger. Please. He stared at me, tears gathering at the corners of his reddened eyes. The man who ordered me to pack my clothes in 20 minutes and enjoy being homeless was now pleading for a financial lifeline. He thought he was offering me a logical transaction, a fair trade to secure the final piece of the family puzzle. But logistics operators do not purchase liabilities disguised as assets. I sat quietly, listening to the hum of the climate control system and the endless pinging of his discarded smartphone. I looked at the broken operator begging for $1 million. He did not understand the true nature of the inheritance he had fought so hard to steal. It was time to reveal the final defect hidden inside the deed he just claimed. I looked down the long expanse of the mahogany table. I looked at the man who had stood on the front porch of the guest house, smirking while a locksmith drilled through my deadbolt. I remembered the biting cold of the Iowa winter wind sweeping across the frozen lawn. I remembered the feeling of holding my mother's heavy brass urn, packing my duffel bag, and sitting in the dark cab of my Honda, watching the power cut to my home. He was offering to sell me the estate for $1 million. He framed the proposal as a mutually beneficial transaction, a necessary step to unify the property grid. He believed the sprawling 8-bedroom farmhouse held inherent value to me simply because our family possessed it for decades. He thought I wanted the sentimental victory of owning the walls where we grew up. I will not give you $1 million. Richard, I stated, my voice flat and devoid of any negotiating inflection. In fact, I would not take the deed to that structure if you offered to transfer it to me for free. Richard blinked his red-rimmed eyes, widening in profound confusion. The bargaining tactic derailed, hitting a wall of unexpected apathy. But you own the land around it, he stammered, his voice thin and raspy. The residential house sits in the geographic center of the 400 acres. You hold the logistics firm and the commercial routes. It makes no sense to leave the primary structure under separate ownership. If you buy it, you control the entire perimeter. You secure the legacy. Yes, I replied, acknowledging the spatial geography. I do control the entire perimeter. But acquiring that specific structure does not secure a legacy. It simply transfers a liability. I reached into the final tabbed section of my primary binder. I extracted a single crisp sheet of paper, printed on heavy bonded stock. The document bore the familiar official letterhead of a prominent regional lending institution. I placed the paper flat on the polished wood and pushed it toward him. The paper glided across the smooth surface, rotating slightly before coming to a halt near the discarded vibrating smartphone. Unfortunately for you, Richard, I continued, my tone remaining clinically detached, since you utilized forged documents to accelerate the probate process, demanding an expedited execution of the primary will today, the legal title to the physical house just officially transferred into your name. You are the documented owner of record. He looked down at the document. The header displayed a formal notice of impending collection. His eyes scanned the bold text tracking the dense numerical figures occupying the center paragraph. That specific residential structure carries a $1.2 million balloon mortgage, I explained, delivering the final mathematical execution. Richard gasped. The sound was sharp, involuntary, a physical reaction to a sudden, invisible blow. He leaned closer to the table, gripping the edge of the mahogany as if the room were tilting sideways. 5 years ago, when he launched his second tech startup focusing on algorithmic food delivery systems, he secured initial venture capital by assuring investors he held substantial liquid backing. When the startup burned through the initial funding in less than 8 months, he faced catastrophic breach of contract lawsuits from the primary developers. Our parents stepped in to prevent their golden son from facing litigation. They could not liquidate the farm acreage without triggering massive capital gains penalties and crippling the logistics operation I was building. Instead, they leveraged the only remaining unencumbered asset. They took out a high-interest balloon mortgage against the primary residential house. A balloon mortgage requires small monthly interest payments for a set duration, culminating in a massive lump sum payment of the entire principal at the end of the term. Mom and Dad executed that specific loan structure 5 years ago to pay off your failed delivery application, I stated, reminding him of the genesis of the debt. They took the liability to shield you from the developers. The small monthly interest payments drained their liquid savings, eventually forcing me to subsidize their hospice care. I paused, allowing his eyes to find the specific due date printed in bold black ink at the bottom of the bank notice. The 5-year term matures next month, I concluded. The payment is due in full in exactly 30 days. Richard stared at the paper, his breathing turning shallow and rapid. He was performing the terminal arithmetic in his head. He had orchestrated a midnight forgery. He had alienated his wife. He had alienated his extended family. And he had alienated his only sibling, all to seize an asset he believed would grant him immense wealth. Instead, his impatience cemented his ruin. By rushing the legal clock and claiming the executor title, he bypassed the standard probate review period. If he had allowed the estate to process normally, the debt would have surfaced during the discovery phase. The house would have been liquidated by the bank to cover the outstanding principal, leaving him with nothing. But by demanding immediate possession, he accepted the asset with all attached encumbrances. He was now personally, legally responsible for producing $1.2 million in 30 days. He possessed no equity. He possessed no venture capital. His Chicago townhouse was in foreclosure. His offshore crypto accounts were empty, drained to pay the Vegas syndicate. He was staring down the barrel of a 7-figure debt with zero liquidity. He opened his mouth, trying to formulate a response, but his vocal cords refused to engage. The psychological shock paralyzed him, trapping him in a silent, hyperventilating panic. As he stared at the looming balloon mortgage, his discarded smartphone lying inches from the document ceased its relentless vibration. The screen went dark for a fraction of a second, resetting the digital display. Then a new notification illuminated the glass. The device began ringing aloud, projecting a sharp, sustained electronic tone across the quiet conference room. The caller ID displayed a specific internal routing number identifying the source of the incoming transmission. The text on the screen read, First National Bank, Fraud Division. The timing was immaculate, a perfect convergence of logistical planning and automated banking protocol. When I sat in my Honda outside the guest house 3 days prior, staring at the locked joint trust account on my banking app, I did not just passively observe the $42,000 wire transfer. In supply chain mechanics, identifying a compromised node requires an immediate, automated response to quarantine the surrounding network. I possessed secondary proxy authority on the trust. The moment I witnessed the unauthorized outbound wire routing to the Miami offshore crypto exchange, I initiated a formal, high-level fraud alert with the primary lending institution. I flagged the transaction as a potential instance of elder financial abuse, executing a protocol that triggered a deep structural audit of the associated account numbers. Financial institutions operate on stringent federal regulations regarding suspicious offshore capital movement. When a fraud division detects a confirmed anomalous wire transfer, they do not simply freeze the point of origin. They execute a cascading freeze protocol, locking down every single account linked to the Social Security number of the initiating party, pending a full federal investigation. Richard stared at the ringing phone. The word fraud pulsed in bright white letters against the dark screen. "The bank is calling to inform you of a comprehensive administrative freeze," I stated, translating the incoming call for him. "Due to the $42,000 offshore wire fraud I reported on Tuesday morning, they have initiated a lockdown on your entire financial profile. Your checking accounts, your savings, your credit lines, every piece of plastic carrying your name is currently suspended." The ringing continued, a persistent mechanical alarm echoing off the glass windows. He was inheriting a $1.2 million balloon debt while possessing completely frozen financial assets. He could not access capital to pay the mortgage. He could not secure a secondary loan because his credit profile was flagged for federal fraud. He could not sell the property to developers because the landlocked residential structure possessed no commercial value without the surrounding acreage I controlled. He was trapped in a financial vice grip entirely engineered by his own unchecked greed and impulsive arrogance. If he had simply allowed the legal process to unfold, if he had not forged the documents, if he had not rushed the reading to evict me, he might have walked away empty-handed but free. Instead, his obsession with power forged his own absolute destruction. Arthur Davis reached forward, placing his pen softly onto the legal pad. The elderly attorney looked at me, the expression on his weathered face reflecting a quiet, profound respect for the total, comprehensive nature of the checkmate. The two security guards stood silently near the doors, their posture relaxed, realizing their services were no longer required. You cannot physically escort a man out of a building when he lacks the physical strength to stand up. I sat back in my heavy leather chair watching the final realization settle over my brother. The minor conflicts, the forged notes, the stolen suits, the petty demands, they all dissolved, leaving only the crushing weight of the ultimate reality. The execution was complete. It was time to leave the battlefield and survey the territory I had secured. The relentless ringing of the smartphone finally ceased, redirecting the fraud division call to an automated voicemail inbox. The sudden quiet in the mahogany conference room felt heavier than the noise. The tension did not dissipate, it merely settled, coating the walls and the polished furniture like a thick layer of industrial dust. Arthur Davis reached across his desk pad and pulled a classic desktop calculator toward his center workspace. The elderly attorney tapped the plastic keys, the rhythmic clack, 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 echoing in the still air. He was performing the final arithmetic required to close the probate ledger. He entered the regional tax assessments, the acreage multipliers, and the projected quarterly yields of the logistics firm. He finished his calculation and pushed his wire-rimmed glasses higher onto the bridge of his nose. He looked across the long expanse of the table, focusing his tired but perceptive gaze on me. "Elizabeth the lawyer," said his voice dropping into a solemn official register, "for the final record of this proceeding, what is the current assessed value of your inherited holdings encompassing the holding company, the logistics operation, and the agricultural real estate?" I did not need a calculator to answer the question. I tracked my net worth the same way I tracked inbound freight shipments, with unyielding daily precision. I looked at Richard. My brother was still gripping the edge of the table, staring at the balloon mortgage document outlining his impending seven-figure ruin. His knuckles were pale, his breathing shallow and erratic. $12.5 million, I said, keeping my delivery perfectly flat. The number hung in the conditioned air, raw and empirical. Richard tried to inhale, but his respiratory system refused to cooperate. The vast, staggering delta between his reality and mine finally shattered his remaining cognitive defenses. He realized he had spent 3 years treating a multimillionaire like a disposable servant. He had burned his marriage and his freedom to steal a mountain of debt, while I quietly secured a fortune. His eyes rolled back, the whites flashing under the recessed overhead lighting. His fingers lost their grip on the edge of the mahogany table. He began hyperventilating, his chest heaving in rapid, useless spasms. His posture folded inward. He slipped out of the heavy leather executive chair, his body crumpling downward like a puppet with severed strings. He hit the polished marble floor with a dull, heavy thud, landing in a heap of wrinkled, bespoke fabric and sweat. He lay on the cold stone, curled into a fetal position, locked in the grip of a silent, paralyzing panic attack. His mouth opened and closed, fishing for oxygen, his eyes staring blankly at the underside of the conference table. The two private security contractors standing near the double doors did not flinch. They did not rush forward to administer aid or offer comfort. They were hired to neutralize physical threats and protect the structural integrity of the room. A man collapsing under the weight of his own financial hubris did not trigger their intervention protocols. They simply watched him writhe on the floor with detached professional apathy. I stood up from my chair. I reached forward and gathered my 3 tabbed binders, stacking them in neat chronological order. I slid my laptop into the center compartment of my leather satchel, snapping the brass buckles shut. I moved with the calm, methodical efficiency of a corporate director concluding a successful quarterly review. I slung the heavy strap of the satchel over my shoulder and walked around the perimeter of the long table. I stopped when I reached the head of the boardroom, looking down at the broken operator shivering on the marble tiles. "Oh, and Richard?" I said, my voice carrying a quiet, conversational tone. He squeezed his eyes shut, turning his head away, pressing his cheek against the cold floor. He did not want to hear another word, but the architecture of my perimeter required one final adjustment. Since the deed to your residential structure only covers the immediate footprint of the foundation, your house is entirely landlocked by my 400 acres of soil, I explained, detailing the geographic reality of his new prison. You lack municipal street access. The 2-mile gravel driveway connecting the county highway to your front porch resides solely on my commercial deed. He let out a ragged, whimpering exhale, realizing the trap contained a secondary locking mechanism. I am legally installing a commercial security gate at the property line tomorrow morning, I informed him, setting the final logistical parameter. Since you do not hold an established legal easement, the private access fee is $500 per entry. It will cost you $500 every single time you wish to drive to your own front door. You will bleed out simply attempting to sleep in your own bed. I did not wait for him to respond. He possessed no words left to offer. I turned away from the wreckage, walking past the unblinking security guards, and pushed the heavy frosted glass doors open. I stepped into the outer corridor, leaving the mahogany suite, the forged documents, and the toxic legacy behind me. I traversed the penthouse reception area. The administrative assistant sitting behind the granite desk kept her eyes glued to her keyboard, pretending to type, refusing to acknowledge the severe shift in the atmospheric pressure. I pressed the elevator call button. The brushed steel doors opened, accepting me into the silent descending cabin. When I reached the ground floor lobby, I pushed through the heavy brass revolving doors and stepped out into the crisp Iowa air. The winter wind hit my face sharp and clearing, carrying the distinct scent of frozen pine and distant snow. The oppressive lemon polish smell of the legal suite washed away, replaced by the unfiltered reality of the open world. I walked toward the underground parking garage, but I bypassed the designated visitor row where I had parked the aging Honda Civic. The sedan was a reliable utilitarian tool, a vehicle I used to fly under the radar while managing hospice runs and avoiding my brother's scrutinizing gaze. It served its purpose, but it did not reflect my current operational capacity. I walked deeper into the concrete structure, stopping in front of a reserved executive space. Resting in the shadows was a brand-new, heavy-duty Ford F-150 King Ranch Edition. The truck gleamed under the fluorescent garage lights, showcasing the deep metallic paint and the rugged, reinforced suspension. I had authorized the purchase through the Logistics LLC the previous week, recognizing the need for a proper utility vehicle to manage a 400-acre agricultural holding company. I pressed the unlock button on my fob. The headlights flared, illuminating the concrete wall. I climbed into the spacious cabin, sinking into the premium heated leather. I pressed the ignition sequence, and the powerful diesel engine roared to life, a low, throaty rumble that vibrated through the steering column. I guided the truck out of the subterranean garage, merging into the mid-morning downtown traffic. I left the towering glass and steel structures of the financial district behind, navigating the highway interchanges until the dense urban grid thinned out, giving way to the sprawling open fields of the rural Midwest. I drove for 40 minutes, watching the frozen corn stalks blur past the window. The sky above was a vast, unbroken expanse of pale winter gray. I reached the county highway turnoff, engaging the turn signal and slowing the heavy vehicle. I turned onto the familiar 2-mile gravel access road. The tires crunched over the loose, frozen stone, kicking up a trail of white dust in my wake. I drove past the spot where the installation crew would erect the commercial toll gate the following dawn. I did not drive all the way to the guest house. I guided the truck off the gravel and piloted it up a gentle, sloping ridge overlooking the center of the valley. I shifted the transmission into park, leaving the diesel engine idling. I rested my hands on the steering wheel, looking out through the windshield. Down in the center of the depression sat the sprawling, aging farmhouse. From this high vantage point, the structure looked remarkably small, isolated, and decaying. It was an 8-bedroom monument to a past that no longer existed. The roof required repairs, the paint peeled along the exterior siding, and the windows stared out blankly into the cold. Richard fought with every ounce of his deceptive energy to claim that rotting structure. He believed inheriting the title would crown him as the undisputed victor of our family hierarchy. He forged signatures, he screamed demands, he hired guards, and he locked me out in the freezing dark just to secure the deed. Now he owned it. He possessed a worthless, depreciating liability, carrying a 7-figure debt, surrounded by a sea of hostile terrain he could never cross without paying a toll. He wanted me to experience the terror of being homeless. Instead, I engineered a scenario where his home became his absolute, inescapable prison. I sat in the warm cabin of the truck, feeling the steady vibration of the engine, listening to the quiet isolation of the Iowa winter. For 34 years, I allowed familial obligation to dictate my boundaries. I accepted the burden of the reliable daughter while excusing the predation of the golden son. I believed sharing a bloodline required absorbing the collateral damage of their endless mistakes. But watching the farmhouse sit silent and empty in the valley below, the truth clarified in my mind, stripping away decades of conditioned guilt. Biology is an accident. Protection is a choice. And I chose myself. The aging farmhouse sitting landlocked and silent in the frozen Iowa Valley is more than just a geographic prison for a ruined brother. It stands as a sprawling, decaying monument to a distinctly tragic family dynamic. When we hear the story of Elizabeth and Richard, it is easy to focus on the spectacular collapse inside that mahogany conference room, the forged documents, the offshore crypto accounts, the digital ledgers that executed a flawless checkmate. But the true tragedy of the Anderson family did not begin with a forged signature at 2 a.m. It began decades earlier, in the quiet, everyday moments of childhood, rooted in a fundamental misunderstanding of what it means to raise a human being. In American culture, the traditional family structure is often built around the pursuit of legacy. We work grueling hours, we pay down mortgages, and we accumulate assets with the singular, noble intention of leaving our children a better life than the one we inherited. But in the desperate rush to provide a secure future, parents frequently forget that their primary obligation is not to prepare the inheritance for the children, but to prepare the children for the inheritance. Richard was not born a monster. He was meticulously, carefully crafted into one by the very people who loved him most. Whenever we examine a family system that produces an entitled predator and an exhausted protector, we inevitably find a profound lack of emotional accountability. From a young age, parents naturally identify the differing temperaments of their children. Some children, like Elizabeth, demonstrate early resilience. They solve their own math problems, they mend their own scraped knees, and they learn to navigate the world with quiet competence. Other children, like Richard, stumble. They complain, They falter and they demand rescue. The fatal error occurs when parents mistake a competent child for an invulnerable one, and a struggling child for a fragile one. In their desire to shield their son from the harsh friction of the real world, the Anderson parents engaged in a slow, steady drip of infinite rescue. When Richard failed, he was not taught to survey his wreckage and rebuild. He was simply handed a broom by parents who had already swept up the glass. That endless safety net mutated his character. When a child is never allowed to feel the heat of the fires they set, they do not learn fire safety. They simply learn how to strike matches with impunity. They grow to believe that the universe, and their family, exists solely to absorb their collateral damage. This is where the concept of family responsibility is so frequently warped. We are told that family protects family. But protection without boundaries is just subsidization. Taking out a 7-figure balloon mortgage against a generational home to pay off a son's failed tech startup is not an act of love. It is an act of cowardice. It is the action of parents who lack the emotional fortitude to look their golden child in the eye and say the most agonizing, necessary word in the parenting vocabulary: no. By shielding Richard from his own failures, his parents cannibalized their own twilight years. They drained the resources meant for their end-of-life care, forcing their daughter to step in and subsidize their hospice nurses. They thought they were saving their son, but they were actually sacrificing their daughter to sustain an illusion. Fairness in parenting is rarely about the equal distribution of financial assets. True fairness is the equal distribution of accountability. It requires the emotional awareness to recognize when your desire to nurture is actively stunting a child's moral development. If you teach one child that their only value is to serve as the structural foundation, and you teach the other that their only role is to stand on top of it and take the applause, you are writing the blueprint for a future war. Elizabeth's ultimate triumph was not a victory of malice. It was a victory of boundaries. She did not destroy her brother. She simply removed the artificial scaffolding that had been holding him up his entire life, allowing gravity to finally do its long-delayed work. She became the parent he never had, delivering the one thing he had successfully avoided for 3 decades: a consequence. If you are listening to this, there is a high probability that you recognize the quiet ache of the reliable child. You know what it feels like to be the infrastructure of your family. You know the exhaustion of watching the people you love pour their energy, their resources, and their forgiveness into the one person who routinely burns it all down to the ground. You know the silent, heavy realization that the people meant to be your safe harbor are actually the storm you must fortify yourself against. If Elizabeth's journey from the freezing dark of that driveway to the warm cabin of her own hard-earned independence resonates with the unspoken realities of your own life, I invite you to join our community. Take a moment to subscribe to the Elena Vengeance channel. We share these narratives because the deepest wounds are often inflicted behind closed front doors, and there is profound power in realizing you are not the only one who had to build a fortress out of the stones your family threw at you. Drop a comment and share your own experience, because every time one of us breaks the silence, another person finds the courage to change their own locks. As you reflect on the Andersons, consider the architecture of your own dinner table. Look at the people sitting around it. Consider the unspoken rules governing who is expected to pour the water and who simply expects their glass to be full. We spend our lives believing that blood is an unbreakable bond, a sacred tether that demands our endless loyalty regardless of the cost. But a tether that only pulls you underwater is not a bond. It is an anchor. And the most terrifying, liberating moment of adulthood is the day you look at the heavy chain wrapped around your ankle, look at the people holding the other end, and realize that the key to unlocking it was resting in your own pocket the entire time. You just have to decide if you are finally willing to walk away from the water.